They come dragging it. All right. So announcements. Yesterday.
Yeah.
Meeting. We have virtual participants. It's being
Yeah.
recorded, live streamed. Ask questions using the QR code. That's pretty much it.
Okay.
There's nothing special to announce right
Yeah. All right. I'll go ahead and get us started. All right. Good morning, everyone. I feel like a lounge singer or something with this microphone out in front of you. Welcome to day 2 of the Water Quality Coordinating Committee meeting. Really appreciate everyone's participation yesterday and day 1. Reflecting on our discussions, again, kind of struck by the intersection of what is a lot of ongoing work, whether it's our response to the Sackett decision, whether it's our tribal beneficial use work, whether it's our racial equity work. Very fortunate for a lot of leadership within this room, and just thank you for yesterday's discussion, and looking forward to, especially on the tribal beneficial use work, going back to the chairs and the chairs meeting and really trying to figure out, what might be best for follow-up, particularly when it comes to engaging other regional board members that are also looking to connect to the work. Because as we heard, the tribes have a caucus and are working on their end to continue to have structured engagement. And I think that with all the great work I know Adriana has done, and that at the staff level, our folks meet quarterly, your regional board staff, our staff, the missing layer maybe, here amongst us to really help bring that leadership at the regional board level and ensure that there is follow-up across this discussion, so that we're not just having kind of a one-off discussion here at WQCC, but maybe some forum for follow-up here all amongst us into the years ahead, or to the months ahead into next year's meeting. So quick, again, just notes, things are being webcast and recorded and live streamed on both the Cali PA website and on YouTube. Bathroom locations are out and around the corner. Again, notice the exits. If there is an emergency, we'll calmly file out to Cesar Chavez Plaza. All questions can be submitted if you would like digitally on the QR code out on the tables. And I think that wraps up my announcements for this morning and gets us into our first or our last round of regional board. No, not our last, second to last round of last round. It is last round. So I invite regions 4, 5, and 6 up to the table. No, why am I have the wrong agenda. It's on the screen, so there you go. I can even just look behind me. All right, 7 and 8, 9. Thank you, guys. And please come on up. We can begin our discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Paula Rasmussen, Executive Officer of the Colorado River Basin Regional Board. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the new river at the international boundary. And I think I missed the part of the instructions for a success story, but it is a challenge, so I did want to share this with you. Next slide, please. This is the new river that's shown in yellow. It flows from the border, from across the border from Mexicali, Mexico, into Calexico in California, and then it flows to the Salton Sea. The current channel of the New River and the Salton Sea itself were formed around 1905 when there was a breach in diversionary structures on the Colorado River, and the entire flow went into the Salton Basin for a couple of years, and that created the Salton Sea and the New River channel that it exists today. The New River is seriously polluted. It has discharges of waste from domestic, agricultural, and industrial sources in Mexico and sources in California, primarily from irrigated lands in the Imperial Valley. Since the 40s, the New River has been acknowledged for its significant water pollution problems. And in the 70s, it had the reputation for being one of the most polluted rivers in the United States. And many of the pollutants pose serious health risks to nearby residents. The sources have included treated and untreated industrial discharges, effluent from wastewater treatment plants, urban stormwater discharges, and agriculture runoff on both sides of the border. Next slide. The regional board has actively monitored the quality of the river at the boundary, and we've been doing this since about 1975. In the 90s, there was funds from EPA that were provided for monthly monitoring, and this was to assess improvements that were being made in Mexico to see how the water quality improved at the border. Since around 2002, that sampling has continued depending on funding availability, and it's been funded by the state. Monitoring data still indicates that the river's polluted with bacteria, silt, nutrients, pesticides, and trash. The picture that you see is of our staff that are taking the samples from the New River at the boundary crossing in Calexico. Next slide. Now, the role of the regional board is that we regulate and we monitor discharges into the New River in California. We control pollution from non-point sources, mainly agriculture, through our irrigated lands activities. We do have a general order for irrigated lands in the Imperial Valley. And we also regulate point sources, which includes sewage treatment plants. And we do the water quality monitoring that I mentioned. The water quality monitoring is monthly, and we monitor for pathogens, nutrients, total suspended solids, among other things. We post the results of this monitoring on our website at the New River Mexicali Sanitation Program. And it's studied to determine the impacts of the infrastructure projects in Mexicali and for conformance with water quality standards and treaty agreements. The picture that you see there is a historical photo. I think it was taken in the 70s. And this was of a drainage ditch upstream of a Mexicali dump that led to the New River. I think things have gotten a little bit better since then. Next slide. Now, staff at our regional board participate in a binational technical committee. This was established by the International Boundary and Water Commission to address sewage infrastructure problems in Mexicali. And representatives on the committee include federal, state, and local representatives from both the United States and from Mexico. The committee talks about actions that are being taken by the State Public Services Commission of Mexicali to improve the sewage infrastructure in Mexico and to improve water quality in the New River. Projects that are being conducted include improvements to the collection system, rehabilitation for pumping facilities, and improvements to the existing lagoons and discussions about expansions of the wastewater treatment plant in Mexicali. The committee has led to improved communication and technology transfer between our two countries. Next slide. Improvements to the sewage infrastructure in Mexicali have eliminated approximately 10 to 20 million gallons a day of raw sewage that were historically present in the New River at the border. The efforts in Mexico have eliminated many untreated and partially treated industrial discharges of waste, and there have been significant measurable improvements in the water quality of the New River at the border, particularly with the nutrients and dissolved oxygen. However, there is still, the water quality does not meet water quality objectives for California. And the river is still impaired for nutrients, pesticides, heavy metals, and toxicity. So we have seen improvements. Much more is needed to be done in the water quality of the New River. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Jane.
Hi. Feel the love. I feel the love. And I have an amazing board. We had so much fun last night. Anyway, yeah, I want to talk just quickly. I'm going to try to reduce the technical talk and talk a little bit more about our public outreach on a few projects, because there's been this shift and this change, and we're trying to change how we see our role in our communities and how we approach things. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about two projects that we have. First is the former Ford Aero Neutronics property. It's a cleanup site, and then I'll cover a little bit where we are with our racial equity resolution. Next slide. This site has been, we could talk for hours, so I'm going to just give you the quick summary of what's happening here. This is Newport Beach. It's a former aerospace research and development center that was managed by Ford. They closed down in 1993. The site was cleaned up. There was contamination of volatile organic compounds, mainly trichloroethene is the compound that we're concerned about, as well as tetrachloroethene. So I'll just call them volatile organic compounds. Carcinogens, things that we need to be worried about. There was site remediation up until 96. And then there was soil closure by the Orange County Healthcare Agency in 97. And then the property was rezoned for residential. It was passing all of our requirements and screening levels. And then there was off-site groundwater contamination, and that's when the site transferred to the regional board. And we began to evaluate and look for remediation opportunities for the groundwater systems, which was basically in situ bioremediation, which is you let the environment take care of the compound and monitor as you go forward. However, in 2014, EPA came up with some new screening levels for TCE and vapor. And San Francisco Bay Regional Board developed environmental screening levels that we use down at our regional board for TCE. These levels were much lower than what was when the site was closed. And so starting in 2017, we began to evaluate what is the impact of the vapor intrusion into potentially residential homes over this site, because there is residual groundwater, soil contamination and groundwater contamination. So we had, next slide, we had Ford come up with a conceptual site model. And this is just a pictorial that just shows you if you have contamination in the groundwater or in the soil, how it can eventually get into a structure or homes. And there's about 588 homes that have the potential to be impacted by these vapors, and 3 commercial properties. And I just want to go to the next slide, because the most important aspect of this project, one is to get it cleaned up. Obviously, that's our goal in our charter, but it was to communicate with the residents. And how do we communicate with them? This is a scary thing. If you're in your home and water board knocks on the door, says we want to test your vapor, you know what? You can't just say this is what we're going to do. This we can't wear our. I was just talking to Ben. You can't wear your regulatory hat here. You cannot. You have to come in and listen, and you have to explain things clearly. We have had, since this started, we meet quarterly with the community. There's 30 to 40 people in attendance at these meetings. We have experts there on toxicology from WIHA. We have Office of Public Participation, who's been fantastic, by the way, to help us to take our technical words and put them into explainable, understandable language. And it's been very successful, and it hasn't been easy. The concerns were health, the concerns were property values. We also have a really good RP. Ford has done everything, and they're going above and beyond to correct the problem. And as there's discoveries found, there's interim measures for mitigation to remove the vapors and to solve the problem. So, end result is there's 588 homes, 363 have been attested. They have to volunteer. We don't just go into people's homes, but 29 of them showed vapor intrusion from this actual site. And 22 of them are co-located, kind of a good indicator that it's coming from the site as well. And so mitigation measures are being put in place. If there's a couple of projects that are going to be more long-term, going to be put in place. Those communities, we meet with them, we talk to them, and we answer their questions. This effort includes meetings, fact sheets. We have a website. Ford has a website. We have our website. We have an 800 call-in number. All the information is hard copy in the library. So we're doing a lot of different things to make sure that the information is understood. And so far, if things are going smoothly, and hopefully it will continue till we get this resolved. So we learned a lot about how to communicate with communities through this project. It's not disadvantaged, obviously. This is probably some of the wealthiest people you'll find in this area, but they've been very responsive to our approach and just really listening. And I just want to commend Jessica Law is just very good at this. She developed relationships. She went out of her way to make sure that you're really understanding what the situation is. And also, I'll just highlight Mona Beirus and Eric Lindbergh, both they've just done an outstanding job. And so we're kind of using this site as a model. Next slide. Sorry, Dave. Our racial equity resolution, we're working very diligently on it. We've got kind of 3 areas. We're starting internally. We're teaching ourselves about our communities, our tribes, what's going on. What does it mean to correct environmental injustices? What does it mean to identify what the needs are? And then how could we adjust our programs to it? So we really felt that it was important to get our staff all on board before we actually go out into the communities. My board has been so supportive and providing quite a bit of information. I've got board members that work with their communities all the time, and their information has been valuable to help us to understand how to shift our minds. We have to change our mindset. That's what we have to do. And I have been doing some outreach to some of the local advocacy groups around our area to try to identify our need. I keep running into within the Santa Ana region, it's really an air pollution problem from all of the trucks and the motors. That's really where our NGOs are focused. But when I talk to them about water, it's kind of like a blank slate. They don't really know what we do. So that's going to be a focus of correction for us moving forward with our resolution. And that's all I have. And I'm going to meet with Ben and learn how to work with tribes.
Thank you so much, Jane. Please, join me in thanking Jane. And we'll do questions and comment after Dave goes here. Please do submit any digital questions you have, and we'll kick it over to Dave.
Thank you very much. I don't think it's any mystery what I'm going to report on as our top priority. So next slide, please. And can you push on the video link? It should play. Well, that is the Tijuana River just a few weeks ago. It is currently flowing at about 20 to 30 million gallons per day of absolutely raw sewage. It doesn't even pretend to be runoff anymore. And that has been the case all this last year. And indeed, it was flowing at a higher level at the time that this photograph was taken. It was about 40 million gallons per day. There's a lot of reasons for that. But this issue, as you no doubt know, goes back many decades. And in fact, the regional board, it was early formed one of its first actions was Resolution 53-5, 1953, asking the International Boundary and Water Commission, or IBWC, to intercede with Mexico on sewage sources and to try to control them. I'll just deviate for a moment and point out that Tijuana was not the only place with sewage problems at that time. San Diego Bay received raw sewage and as well as partially treated sewage. And the Tijuana River was being used by Imperial Beach. Remember that, Imperial Beach, as their wastewater treatment plant. Natural ecosystems absorb wastewater, they thought. So we had a history of that. The Water Board worked very hard collaboratively with the US Navy, with the City of San Diego, with the predecessor of the Port of San Diego to change that. And the solution was a regional collection system that would grow as the communities grew, in a regional treatment plant at Point Loma. They went through 2 bond acts. The first one failed because people hated to pay more taxes then, just as they do now. The second one succeeded. And the Water Board, again, using both carrots and sticks, brought agencies, including the City of Coronado and Imperial Beach, into the system, and it's grown and advanced since then. And while it does have some issues, it did largely resolve the issues in San Diego Bay. We've had decades of transboundary flows of sewage, industrial wastes, trash, and they've only worsened over the decades. So as I mentioned, it's right now 20 to 35 million gallons per day. And we have 55 Clean Water Act impairments listed for those infected waters. There are 10 total maximum daily loads if you do water quality math that way. We have 2 of them in preparation right now for bacterial indicators and pathogens, 1 for trash. And we have had beach closures now today, 685 consecutive days. Now I ask you, what other part of the country do you have continuous beach closures? Imperial Beach is the only zip code on the coasts in the Western United States where property values have actually dropped during the last 10 years. And Imperial Beach has suffered a significant loss of tax revenue from sales from tourists who would otherwise be visiting that neighborhood. Next slide. So there's the listing of the impairments. I won't read them all off. The most important ones for us right now are bacterial indicators and pathogens. It's a risk of human health, and trash. Those account for the larger number of water bodies, but there are a number of other issues: nutrients, sediments, pesticides, all of the things you would expect to find in industrial wastes, because there are pretreatment plants there that discharge to storm drains, as well as wastewater. Next slide. And there's the beach closure days data. Tracking it since 2015, we've seen a progressive increase. And starting in December 8th of 2021, it was 365 days of consecutive beach closures due to sources in Mexico. Punta Bandera is a location where Tijuana's sewage is pumped and then discharged immediately on the shore. And that's it right there in the photograph, about 30 million gallons per day of raw sewage going onto the beach. It's about 5 miles south of Imperial Beach, so it moves northward on the onshore current. Offshore, it's moved southward, but onshore, it moves northward. And then there's Imperial Beach down below. Next slide. And starting in 2009, the regional board, trying to grapple with the immense problems and multimedia problems, formed the Tijuana River Valley Recovery Team to work with agencies, 30 of them in the United States and in Mexico, to identify ways we could mitigate the damage, manage the situation, and gradually improve source control in Mexico using a binational partnership approach. We have completed several projects, fortunately. This was updated in 2015 with a 5-year action plan. That's now an 8-year action plan, but we're actually getting action on it now. And so several projects have been completed. The Goat Canyon sediment basins were built in 2005, but California never provided funding for maintaining them. So state parks has had to do that out of their own budget. So outreach activities, interpretive activities, habitat management, all sacrificed to pay for operation and maintenance of that basin. You can see it in the upper left photo. And that white stripe across the bottom is a trash boom, working very well. And the lower left photograph is that trash taken out on about that same time. And the lower right photograph is our vision for the valley. So we're contemplating how land use has to be managed to provide for a 25-year floodplain, 3 actively managed channels, only place in the region where we'll use the water course to manage the waste coming across the border, because we have to acknowledge that sources in Mexico are going to be very hard to realize long-term controls of, especially for non-point source pollutants like trash. And then the upper right photo is the Tijuana River in full flood stage during Tropical Storm Hilary. Next slide. Actually, go back for a second. I'm sorry. I just wanted to mention too, we've done an Army Corps of Engineers hydrology and hydraulic study with Mexico. It's binational, so it includes the entire watershed, 75% of which is in Mexico. And we've also done a Minute 320. The treaty between the United States and Mexico provides the commissioners the authority vested entirely in the two commissioners, one for Mexico, one for the US, to craft minutes, which are agreements, amendments essentially of the treaty. Many of them govern water supply that's shared between the two countries and several watersheds, but it also includes water quality. Because of the recovery team's efforts, of which IBWC and EPA were both members, they crafted Minute 320, which is a binational framework to address sediment, water quality, and trash. The three favorite constituents we're always talking about down there. And then we've also been able to receive funding from Senate Bill 507 to do a feasibility study of the 27 projects we originally identified. That became the local agency's point of advocacy for the federal government and the state to fund specific projects. We identified the feasibility, the cost, operations and maintenance costs, identified lead agencies, CEQA, NEPA, permitting, everything that you would need in the cookbook to do that project, we got out of that report. And that became the regional board and 9 other agencies' point of agreement with the federal government in resolution 2019-0246, which we said, these are the projects you should fund. So dropping to the bottom of the slide, it was gratifying to see US EPA identify our projects for the USMCA funding that's come in. And their NEPA study that they've completed, it's about our projects that we've said. These are the ones that will work most efficaciously. We have several projects funded by the state board. Thank you very, very much for those. They're moving forward now on trash booms from the main channel, a trash boom and sediment basin for Smuggler's Gulch, that other actively managed channel, and restoration of hydrology and habitat in the river valley. We've also looked at sediment management, and because we have far more sediment than the estuary can handle, we've already lost about 30% of the estuary to the sediment. We're able to now look at using that sediment to reclaim a quarry. That was the reclamation plan was erosion will fill it in eventually. So Customs and Border Protection did us a solid. They filled in about 1/3 of it. We're going to use the other 2/3 capacity for that sediment from the Goat Canyon and Smuggler's Gulch basins. Clean sediment once it's been sieved, and that's an opportunity for habitat restoration for critical habitat for southern maritime coastal sage scrub. That will all be managed by state parks. Next slide. So why is it so bad? It's much worse now than it's been in any time during the last 20 years since the wastewater treatment plant was built down in San Ysidro to deal with 365 days a year of raw sewage that existed before that in 1997. Next slide. Well, unfortunately, it comes down to the fact that that infrastructure, both in the US and Mexico, simply wasn't maintained. IBWC bought a nice new car, wasn't the best car, didn't get the best gas mileage, and they never changed the tires or rotated them or changed the oil. Points and plugs, still original. So in terms of wastewater treatment plants, the belt presses and bar screens are original. The pumps are original. Everything in the treatment plant goes back to 1997. They just never bought new parts. A water district typically has a capital improvements fund and an asset management plan. They may call it different names. IBWC as a federal agency does not have those things. They always hope their federal budget allocation, which never changed, would have just enough money to do something. They have another wastewater plant in Nogales. They have 2 dams on the Rio Grande. They have other commitments they have to make. That money's never been there for this plant. So they've had a number of issues, which the Water Board acknowledged in a cease and desist order in 2021, saying these are things you need to do to get back in compliance with secondary effluent standards. Right now, they have a junction box 1, which is their influent control valve. They can't turn down the flow. So during the storms, they were over 320% over capacity because that valve is welded open in full open condition. So that's an issue. The international collector is cracked. So if it gets full capacity, it's flowing into the Tijuana River. And then their primary settling basins, and you'll see a photograph in just a moment. Go ahead and push click. One click, please. There we go. You'll see a photograph in just a moment of the primary settling basins, all 5 completely non-functional anymore. And of their 6 influent pumps, they need 4. They were down to 3. The storm took out 2 of them. They were down to 1 pump and it was vibrating very badly. They very nearly lost the entire plant during the storm. The storm itself, Tropical Storm Hillary, Tropical Cyclone Hillary rather, the collection system in Tijuana, which has not grown with the needs of the city, has tremendous inflow and infiltration issues. We didn't see anything like this in any other wastewater plant in our region, and many of them got more rainfall than Tijuana did. So they had 320% capacity for about 6 hours and 200% capacity for the other 6 hours. So the treatment plant was flooded. They lost both bar racks. They lost all but one of their influent pumps. They lost about 11 other pumps throughout the plant, multiple valves, multiple controls, all failed during the system. Hollister Avenue Pump Station went down. They lost all 4 pumps to sanding. So they were in a terrible state, and they had to bypass about 30 million gallons of untreated wastewater to the ocean outfall during the height of the storm. And yet it could have been worse. The pre-storm damages and the post-storm damages can be concurrently managed. They have 3 contracts in place to fund them. They anticipate restoring the plant to full secondary compliance in 9 to 12 months. Next slide. And we propose to issue, and I'll cover this in a few moments, a time schedule order to make sure that they do and to show the public due diligence on our oversight under the Clean Water Act. But there are system failures in Tijuana that simply overwhelm all of our attempts to control. I'm going to just go ahead and you can just go ahead and start clicking through. A bunch of points on there will appear. Pipeline 1A conveys about 30 million gallons of wastewater to the coast where it's discharged untreated. That's a problem. But right now it's non-functional. It's broken. It failed in 2022. And because it's right on the fence line, and it's next to an adjacent pipeline, it also compromised the other pipelines. So both pipelines were down. And because it's right on the fence, literally on the fence, the federal governments of both countries did not expedite the repairs to the first pump line. So the second one was repaired on very steep slopes in Mexico that the second pipeline, pipeline 1A, could not be repaired. They're working on it right now. The commissioner has pressed very hard at our urgings for the Mexican federal government to expedite those repairs. They were going to wait till next year, maybe April or August-ish. We found that to be unsatisfactory because the average homeowner in Imperial Beach right now comes home to a wastewater plant smell in their home. They're suffering from hydrogen sulfide, from aerosolization. There have been numerous outbreaks of Shigella and E. coli throughout the community before and after the tropical storm. So getting that pipeline repaired is mission critical to at least protecting the residents in San Ysidro and Imperial Beach, and to that matter, in Tijuana itself. The international collector I mentioned has failed. Pump Station 1B conveys wastewater to the coast from Las Laureles Canyon, about 3 to 6 million gallons per day, depending on the day. Shut down inexplicably. Can't get a straight answer why it's not operating. That pump station will eventually be replaced. It appears that they don't want to spend money fixing it in Mexico if it's going to be replaced with a new pump station in 2027. This is a problem. So again, another issue we're trying to address. San Antonio de los Buenos is the wastewater treatment plant that this wastewater is pumped to. That doesn't work. So Mexico is committing their funding, and the bid for it is going out right now to build an 18 million gallon per day oxidation ditch design. My heart fell when I saw that. That's not great for 18 million gallons per day. But it's their choice, and they think they can attain full secondary, and they'll build a 700-foot ocean outfall, whereas right now it goes directly onto the coast. In the Tijuana River gates, several control valves have failed. 6 million gallons added to the river right now of raw sewage. Those repairs are also about to start. Longer term upgrades include the collectors Poniente, Oriente, and Insurgente. Oriente has been finished. We think Collector Poniente and Insurgente are still coming. Those are main trunk lines that convey the wastewater north or south to the treatment plants. And they all converge on the international collector where things have already broken down. But the most important of those projects is the last one there on the list. And EPA is not giving this a catchy name. It needs a name. So maybe I'll pass around a sheet and you can give me some suggestions. But I'm calling it the Recycled Water Export Project for right now. It's not very glamorous. But 2 treatment plants that Mexico built in the 2010s worked very well, La Marita and Arturo Herrera. They were intended to provide recycled wastewater for reuse. So they're not just secondary, they're tertiary. But they have not decided on how to use that water. So it's discharged to the Tijuana River, about 15 million gallons per day. If you take a 5-gallon bucket of clean water and you add a cup of sewage, what do you have? You have 5 gallons in a cup of sewage. And that's exactly what happens in the Tijuana River with those 2 wastewater treatment plants. The water entering the river is fine. It's very quickly not fine, becomes a significant problem. Getting that water out of the watershed was EPA's top priority in negotiating with Mexico, minute 328. Mexico agreed that the water would be sent to Valle Guadalupe. We're going to pay for the pump stations and the pipeline. That work should start during the next year. That will significantly reduce nuisance flows in the river, which we otherwise have to manage. And there's a river diversion at PB Sila at the border that normally diverts that water to the coast. Again, a problem, but a different location. It can't operate while pipeline 1A is out of commission. So getting that water out of the river and getting pipeline 1A will provide immediate relief in both countries for those flows. Next slide. So there's several water board actions that are pending. I mentioned the time schedule order. It should go out to the public on or about Halloween. The IBWC has it right now. They have all of 48 hours to review the administrative draft and get it back to us. They know what's going to be in it. We've talked with them about it. We have the 2 TMDLs. We were planning to do public workshops in November. They'll be pushed out a little bit. And we'll have 8 additional potential TMDLs. But a TMDL, applying the waste loads or load allocations at the U.S. international border does present some very fascinating legal challenges. So while it's possible, and Region 7 has done it, we're looking for some other options. There will be 4 Clean Water Act Section 401s to do for these several projects, the state projects and the federal projects. In the Minute 320 process, we're supporting the regional board, and the San Diego River Conservancy are supporting that project with $175,000 to do the project report, like the Senate Bill 5071, but for Mexico. So it'll do a feasibility study for the projects, identify lead agencies in Mexico for the projects. You can view it as a source control and conveyance control plan. And then how to implement those TMDLs. Well, we're looking at an option now, which we have done in other watersheds for a TMDL alternative. In this case, it would be an MOU or MOA with EPA and with IBWC. We might even invite Customs and Border Protection in just for fun, because they do control that zone. And this would give us a vehicle to govern our permitting process with them, provide for monitoring and assessment of the entire watershed binationally, and also to identify the USMCA projects that would be implemented. Right now, they're not funded. Only one is funded and only partially. That would implement controls in the US and Mexico for all of those constituents of concern I listed earlier. Intercepting and diverting those waste flows out of the river, capturing and controlling trash is the long-term solution. And that's our primary settling basin there. I've never seen trees growing in a settling basin before. I thought that was amazing. EPA said, no, we see it in Hawaii. And that's disappointing, but that is the case. And that sign, the County of San Diego gave up posting temporary signs. That's a permanent sign, which I'm hoping to see retired. And so the real question I would ask is, anybody here willing to take a bet that I think we'll reach 1,000 days of continuous beach closures? We're at 685 right now. I think it's very likely. In fact, we're going to see that, even with pipeline 1A repairs going in. You can't see it very well. The images are covered, but there's a nice trash boom there, and that's an example of what will go in the main channel. We'll try that test design. And this is a public meeting, so I think I can say this safely. One of the purposes of that MOU is if our trash boom that the state of California has funded and IBWC has agreed, we'll let try for an experiment. If it's successful in that design, I'd like to ask IBWC to please adopt it and take it with congressional authorization required, and then operate it. That is Project J of the USMCA. If this design works, why not just go with it? If it doesn't, then it doesn't. But that MOU will identify a pathway for the IBWC to accept projects like this from the United States, from California. But they have to have congressional authorization to do that, and that is a significant challenge. Next slide. There is a roadmap. I'm trust that we'll have these presentations.
Dave, I want to leave some time for questions, so
I'll be done in 1 minute.
Okay, thank you.
I'll leave this for you to look at later. I trust the presentations will go out. There's a roadmap which is underway. We just need to have federal funding for it. Next slide. So I do want to highlight a success story, because the border is depressing and standing next to sewage. And I was going to bring you a bottle of it to have to pass around. Besides the TSA problems, I didn't want to put that in my luggage. So next slide. We have a number of Department of Defense facilities throughout our region. The U.S. military has a very heavy footprint in our region. Camp Pendleton, 2 other Marine Corps bases, 3 Navy bases, ancillary facilities for training. Next slide. And since 2009, we've been collaborating with the Navy. We had a relationship with them that was far less than productive. Admirals and captains were routinely parading before our board in full dress uniform, criticizing the water boards and our uncooperative approach to protecting water quality, which means we didn't agree with their monitored natural attenuation plans. I did ask for a different approach with the Navy. They reciprocated. So the outcome of that has been 146 cleanup sites remediated with climate change provisions. So as sea level rises, the cleanup changes if necessary. 386 underground storage tanks. The Navy has a lot of underground storage tanks. We have a lot of TCE plumes, PCE plumes, and so on. We have 2 MOAs with the Navy and the Marine Corps to address longer standing issues like pesticides and sediments in Camp Pendleton that affect dependents, and also the PCB contaminated sediments in San Diego Bay. And then finally, we have the Fiery Marsh, where the US Navy on the northern shore of Coronado broke every single hazmat rule you ever heard of in terms of dumping materials, burying barrels on that site. It would burn spontaneously for days at a time. So besides the VOCs, which go to the bay right now, we also have PFOS and PFOA. So that's our next big target with the Navy, is to realize that relationship and get real things done. And so we had a leadership council last year, and now we're moving forward on a cleanup approach with the Navy, evaluating the discharges. So that is it for me. Next slide, last slide. And thank you very much for your time and attention today.
Thank you for yours, Dave. Many, many thanks. We could actually just have an entire session on the Tijuana River and just appreciate, I know, your leadership, the long-standing leadership of the regional board, and as well the governor, and ultimately as well the federal administration. I know, we have our challenges all respectively as agencies, but what has been incredible to see is the leadership that has stood up both in DC, here in Sacramento, but importantly at the local level to connect across and hopefully, as I think we all hope, address this for once. This is, as you noted, a cyclical issue. And what we hope is the investment now is one that lasts. So just thank you for that work. And thank you as well, Paula, for the New River flag. And here, incredible parallels, of course, to what's happening in San Diego, different scale, but the same challenges with IBWC, perhaps sometimes, but importantly, these are under-resourced communities. And I think that that's the common theme. And thank you, Jane, for your presentation as well across then, and importantly, flagging the racial equity work. I want to take that opportunity to actually introduce everyone to Veronica Farwell. She recently joined us here at the State Water Board. She's in the Office of Public Participation. I appreciated your nod. I know Adriana's leadership here, really creating a resource for all the regional boards to be more sensitive, to be able to engage with communities and have a common resource. Veronica is here to continue to provide that internally as well, because as you noted, it is that internal, external, and complete cycle of really viewing the challenges our communities face, but importantly, how our folks connect to that work. So across that, I wanted to acknowledge and thank and open up to questions from folks. Mike should come over to you right now. Mike with a mic.
It on? Okay. Sure. Well, thank you for the presentations. And I would suggest that for next year, WQCC, we have a session on the border pollution issues at Region 7 and 9 base. I mean, it was very useful. So I'm John Scandura with the Santa Ana Water Board. And I have a couple quick questions for Paula Rasmussen, and she's my former counterpart at DTSC from many years ago. So I have to ask her tough questions. But as far as the proportion of pollution coming from Mexico and the portion of pollution that's from all the farms and ag and industries in the Imperial Valley, I mean, what percentage of the pollution that we're dealing with that we base our TMDLs on comes from Mexico versus from the United States?
I can't really say off the top of my head, John, because we're actually just starting some of those TMDLs right now. We do have the impairments, but we really need to parse out, the discrete allotments of sources. But, I think primarily what you see is the nature of the waste, because from Mexico, a lot of it is the pathogens, pesticides, and then from the ag, it'll be the silt and the TDS, and then possibly nutrients. But quantifying it, I can't really say off the top of my head.
Sure. And the next question is, and I think is for both David and Paula, as far as funding for the improvements of the treatment plants in Mexico, as well as conveyance lines, is the United States, including the state of California and the federal government, contributing money towards that effort? Because we get the benefits from that.
Yes, we do. In fact, there's been a long-standing practice between the two countries in Tijuana to provide for that. So we worked through the North American Development Bank, which was capitalized in 2020 with an additional $250 million. So they're investing in a lot of those collector repairs right now. And then EPA is putting some of the USMCA money in Minute 328 to specific pump station and pipeline repairs in Mexico. Yes. San Diego and Tijuana are joined at the hip, and we wouldn't want it any other way. We share a culture, we share an economy. We have a vested interest in our neighbors' water security. A point I glossed over is that a key part of the plan is recycled water for reuse, potentially for potable reuse in Tijuana, as the city of San Diego is doing right now. Because when your neighbor does not have water security, you don't have water security is our approach. So yes.
And then in Region 7 or Mexicali?
It would be similar with the NAD Bank, but also in Calexico, the state actually funded recently a project in Calexico to basically take the flows from the New River and encase them through the city of Calexico to lower exposures. That project's barely getting started and it's inching along very slowly. The idea is to put the flows in a pipe and go past the city, because for years, it's been an aesthetic problem for the city and a health problem and an odor problem for the residents. And the project would also include a trash screen to collect trash at the border. So that funding, I think came through in the last year or so. And the project it had a groundbreaking, but I don't know that it's actually broken ground. We had a ceremony.
Then a couple additions to Jane's presentation on Ford. As I mentioned, I worked for DTSC and site cleanup, and fewer sites are as much of a pain to clean up as soil vapor sites, particularly when you have homes over them. And this is really a nightmare site because Ford cleaned up this site according to the standards of the day 25 to 30 years ago. And then developers literally packed the site with luxury townhomes, condominiums, and luxury homes. And then later on, of course, they weren't exactly excited when they got the news that, well, the cleanup wasn't good enough by the new standards. So needless to say, our staff have done an incredible job building a relationship with the residents in that community, and most importantly, with the city of Newport Beach. But it has been an incredible engineering challenge trying to design exactly where to put all the treatment units and blowers and conveyance pipes, because the most optimal locations are people's garages, living rooms, clubhouses. So how they've been able to do that has been short of miraculous. And even despite those best efforts, there were still some residents who were unhappy. And so they appealed the building permit all the way to the city of Newport Beach. And fortunately, the city of Newport Beach supported us on this. So this has been a very challenging site, but I'm very happy to see how our staff have done on this site. Who do I throw this to next?
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Chris.
You can toss it. Yeah, my question is for you, Mr. Gibson. Chris Murray, Region 8. If there's anything we can all do as regional boards to assist with the advocacy efforts in Congress to get the trash project approved and funded, or even just through the regulatory process, just get their interest and approval, please let us know. I think this is one of those areas, and many of these areas that cross our regions, where we really need to pool our resources and support each other collectively. So please know if we can be engaging our own delegations to provide additional assistance, we stand ready to help.
Thank you very much for that. I'll just share that the mayors of all of the cities in San Diego County have joined in voicing their concerns and requests for federal intervention. As I mentioned, there are basically 9 key projects that were identified and studied by EPA. They only have funding for one and partial funding for that. So the total price tag really looks like it'd be like $1.5 billion, given the inflationary costs and increases. And these are all US side projects, by the way. Mexico side are being paid for by Mexico or North American Development Bank. So I appreciate that very much. And it's an option that we'll certainly consider and may reach out to you through your executive officers to avail on that.
Yeah, it's been incredible to see truly the alignment across all the effort, and really appreciate again the leadership in this room and outside of it as well with Secretary Garcia and others. Are there any other questions? Okay, join me in thanking the panel again. As we transition to part 2 of our SACIT decision, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative. What we heard from were all of our incredible executive officers from the regional water quality control boards, and we're very fortunate for that leadership. And who we didn't hear from, though, is Eileen Sobek. And Eileen, I have to say, I'm surprising her in doing this here. And Eileen has been with us since nearly as I've been here at the board, and have only known her leadership as executive director for us. So I know all you have, as executive officers, have come to rely on her, as I have, and with her announcement of her well-deserved transition, and here, just want to create the space to thank her. Eileen isn't one to bring herself in front of everyone and have the spotlight or the attention, but she carries the weight and has carried the weight of this institution through COVID, through a transition of chairs, through a lot of challenges that you all have here collectively been dealing with. And I know, again, I have come to be incredibly dependent upon Eileen. It is not going to be an easy transition, but join me in celebrating her here, and we will continue to, and look forward to continue to be able to work with her. So thank you, Eileen, for your work. Okay, you have that prerogative. Let's transition to our panel then, and we'll welcome up our panelists. And here yesterday, we talked about the legal significance of SACIT. Here we'll now try to delve into some of the practical implications of the SACIT decision, and just want to thank certainly Karen and Patrick and Paul and all the regions at this point, because it has been a group effort to just understand what we're seeing on the ground as the decision has been made, and as EPA brings out its guidance, and importantly, as we think about protecting and maintaining the level of water quality that we have all come to, I can say for my generation, take for granted. And that, here have real critical discussion to ensure how we, for future generations, maintain the progress we've made, let alone continue on these incredible legacy challenges that we've been talking about. So with that, I'll hand it over to Karen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Joaquin, and thanks everyone for being here, and getting to see you in person is great. I see you all on TV frequently. You look better in person, just saying. So yesterday you heard about all of the legal implications of the Supreme Court's SACIT decision. And generally speaking, California has the authority and the regulatory tools to ensure that waters of the state continue to be protected. So that's the good news, right? But that comes with a lot of work to transition away from using federal authority, as you heard yesterday, to state authority. And so the challenge is for us to fill the gaps that the federal authority has left, and the workload associated with that with state resources in our regulatory programs. So Paul's going to provide an overview from the statewide perspective, sort of the practical application of how we're going to address, or we're planning to address. We're still working on this. This is continuing to build a car while we're driving it kind of work. And then Patrick's going to give some examples from a regional board perspective. And so I just get to tee this up and sit back and listen and answer questions after the great presentations that you'll hear. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Paul.
He has a point of order. Who's forwarding the slides?
Next slide, please.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So As Karen said, my name's Paul Han, and I'll be covering the first part of this presentation, and then I'll hand off to Patrick. Yesterday, you guys heard a legal overview of the Sackett decision. Today, we want to dive into the practical implications. There's 3 program areas that we're going to focus on. One is the wetland program. That's really where the main impacts occur. We'll also talk about the NPDS program and the integrated report. Finally, Patrick's going to talk about the Central Valley Water Board experience. Next slide. Thank you. So just as a quick refresher, because I know this is probably not where you guys live most of the time, the Sackett decision did a few really critical things. It limited the definition of waters of the US with regards to wetlands to only those wetlands with a continuous surface water connection. It limited the Clean Water Act to covering only adjoining wetlands. And most importantly, while there's a lot of change going on at the federal level, this doesn't impact our state laws. Next slide. Okay, I really want to emphasize that we are, as Karen said, we're driving the car as we build it. I would almost say we're driving the car as we fly it, because we're not quite sure if we have a car or a plane in some cases. So it's important to know that this is a brand new decision. There are brand new rules coming out of it. We don't yet have guidance from the Corps or EPA about it. There's a lot we don't know. So again, there's 3 program areas that we do want to focus on. Those are the 3 that I mentioned before. In addition to that, there may be others that we will identify later, or we may find out are indirectly impacted. And there's been a couple of them that we're starting to review, and we'll see what comes of that. Next slide. Again, the good news, and Serena showed this yesterday, is that we have a strong California code system. We have a definition of waters of the state that's much broader than the federal definition. I'll just note that in this diagram here for people who are visually, who like the visual, that she was referring to me there. That inner circles is intended to be hazy, and that's because we don't know where this roulette wheel is going to stop. And we have a position that may be fairly stable. Time will tell. We just don't know. So as a result, we've been very deliberate about trying to develop our policies in a way that will accommodate the federal government wherever they land. Next slide. And I want to talk to you about one of the primary tools that we've used to accomplish that. So because those federal rules have been in flux, we have known for a long time that we needed to have a policy that could stand independently of federal jurisdiction. And so in 2019, we adopted the dredger fill procedures, which Serena talked a little bit about, and I'll talk a little bit more about. I want to go down a little bit into the weeds on this just to give you guys the next level of appreciation. The procedures are really organized into 2 major components. That first component is our statewide definition of what a wetland is. So this is, in developing these procedures, we realized that there were 3 critical questions that we needed to address, and we did so in the policy. The first one is, what's the technical definition of a wetland? What does it mean to be a wetland? This is actually a technically complex question, and different agencies approach it differently. We took an approach that was most similar to the Corps of Engineers, and in most cases should end up at the same regulatory outcome as where the Corps would end up with. The second question that we needed to ask about was, what kinds of wetlands do we assert jurisdiction over? Whether it's at the federal level or at the state level, there are certain features that might meet the technical definition of a wetland, but aren't something that we historically have regulated or might be regulated through another one of our program areas. A good example of this is certain portions of a publicly owned treatment works, or some groundwater recharge systems. Those are things that historically we haven't permitted as wetlands, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't overreaching to these procedures. The last thing is the wetland delineation. That's the idea, that's the element of mapping and characterizing the wetlands. So where exactly do they start and where do they stop? And that's pretty important under Sackett. But the most of these three questions, the one that really is most important to SACIT is that second question. SACIT, by restricting the definition of waters of the US, creates the biggest gap to date between whether a wetland is jurisdictional under state or federal regulations and laws. And that has some significant impacts for how we operate our program practically and what this is going to mean from a staffing perspective. And that leads me to the second part of the procedures, which is recognizing that the federal regulations were in flux. We knew that we needed to be able to have a policy that would accommodate wherever the federal grant lands, wherever the federal government landed. And we needed to make sure that our procedures could last through those various changes. So one of the things that we deliberately did is write the procedures so that they were not dependent on whether a water was a water of the state or a water of the a non-federal water of the state or a water of the US. And so we're well placed to be able to address this regulatory change within the program areas. Yeah, thanks. Next slide. So there's a couple of new federal regulations that I want to talk about that are either coming out of SACIT or co-occurring with SACIT. The first one is what Serena talked about yesterday, which is that final revised definition of waters of the US. That was adopted in May of this year, and then the SACIT decision came out and the EPA immediately amended that decision. So that amendment came out in August. In September, the US EPA and the Corps jointly released new rules for 401 certifications. So that's the rule set for when it's a 401 as opposed to a WDR. Again, we tried to write our dredger fill procedures so that we would accommodate both potential outcomes, whether it's a WDR or a water of the state. Sorry, a WDR or 401 certification. Next slide. Okay, so some things that you should know. We, as Serena mentioned, there's no map that tells us where water of the state is or a water of the US. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this area. We really do not know how many waters are going to lose coverage. Based on a records review of our historical projects, we assume it's conservatively 25%. So right now, about 5% of the projects that we have coming through the dredger fill program are non-federal waters of the state only and go through that WDR process. We expect that's going to increase to at least 25%. This has some significant implications for the program. So the first thing to know is the 401 certification process is much more efficient than adoption of a WDR. And there's two critical differences that illustrate this. The first one is WDRs can't currently be delegated to the regional board executive officer, but instead they have to go before the board at a public hearing. Obviously that adds process. Patrick's going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. The second thing is the public noticing requirements are much more substantial. And one of the key differences is that the WDRs require public notices to include the draft of the permit. And so that as compared to the 401, where all you have to do is notice that an application has come in. And the important distinction there is that for the 401 process, you can run that public notification process in parallel with your permit development. Whereas for a WDR, you have to wait until you're finished with that permit development and then go out for public notice and potentially have to then make changes to that permit after you get public comments in. So it doesn't necessarily add work, but it does extend the amount of time required for the process. And again, Patrick's going to talk about this more. In addition to those administrative changes, it's important to know that there are certain services that the Corps has historically provided that are no longer going to be available for projects in non-federal waters. Specifically, the review of wetland delineations. So wetland delineations often require a field review by trained Corps staff, and replacing this service is going to hit us in two ways. The first one is, of course, we're going to have to dedicate staff to this task that we never did before. And the second one is that because we don't traditionally do this work, we've got some capacity development work that we've got to do. My staff is working on training for your staff. And we're actually rolling out some of that information and training today, in fact, right now, at our water quality certification roundtable. So just to give you an idea of scale, again, I mentioned that we're expecting at least 25% of the actions that we previously took as 401 certs to now be taken as WDRs. Assuming that 25%, we get about 1,000 to 1,500 applications a year. So recognizing that some of these permits, hopefully many of these permits can be addressed through existing general WDRs, we're still expecting about 150 permits a year across the state that the regional board should anticipate permitting as a WDR. I'll leave it to you as to determine whether or not you think that's a significant increase or not. While it won't affect us directly, it's important to note that SACIT also has some impacts on the agencies that we partner with. So for example, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a project that goes through the core permitting has a much more streamlined consultation process called Section 7 than if they are trying to go through that consultation process without a permit from the Corps. This is going to complicate our work in a couple of different ways. Number one, it's going to make those discussions with our partner agencies take longer. It may also serve to encourage people to accept core jurisdiction where they might otherwise challenge it. So time will tell. The last thing I want to mention is, again, we don't have guidance documents from the Corps of Engineers. We don't have guidance documents from US EPA. We anticipate that those will come out. It may be years before they come out. So there's a lot of uncertainty and expect a lot of change in this area. Next slide. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the 401 rule. This doesn't come specifically from SACIT, but it's co-occurring with the new Waters of the US rule, and it's something that you guys are going to have to deal with. The good news is that the new 401 rule melds pretty well with our statewide procedures. There's a lot of return to status quo that really works in our favor. But there are a few nuances, and you guys should be aware of them. The first one is that the previous administration's rule introduced the idea of a pre-filing meeting request. That requirement has carried through to the new 401 certification process. That is not currently required by our dredger fill procedures, though I will say from a staff perspective, it's a good process and it's useful for both staff and applicants. The second thing is the 401 rule requires a copy of the federal permits. This is a return to status quo, and this has always been required under our state regulations, but it is a bit of a change from the prior federal rules, and it may be a source of confusion for some applicants. That's certainly an issue that we typically see when we're processing these permits. The last thing I wanted to mention was that the new rule provides clarity on when certifying agencies can request additional information. This is actually a pretty good change for us. And that's because it allows us explicitly to include the dredger fill procedures as part of the requirements for that federal application. It allows us to say, hey, feds, we don't have a complete application and we get to determine what complete means. And that's really useful for us because as we've looked historically at what causes delays and confusion in the permitting, most of that time is caught up in us trying to get the right information from the applicants. So we've worked really hard with the procedures, and that's that part 2 of those procedures and that 2 parts that I was talking about. We worked really hard to try and figure out how to provide clarity in this area. I've left some websites there for you if you're interested in more information. There's one particular website that I wanted to note, which is that that last one. So somebody asked yesterday about training and outreach, and I just wanted to note that we did do public training on these procedures. That training was recorded. The recording is posted to our website at that second link. We also have a completeness checklist to help applicants try and make sure that we get the right information the first time. That's an area that we're really trying to invest in to make sure that we drive efficiencies. Next slide. Again, with the 401 rule, there's some things that you guys should know about for the regional boards. So the first thing to know is that the new rule revises the reasonable period of time. The previous rule set a default of 60 days. The new rule sets a default of 6 months, which is good for us. In practice, we don't generally need 6 months for most permits. Our median right now, I think, is running at about 107 days for both individual and general orders. But the good news is that it can be established in advance through an agreement with the Corps of Engineers. We developed such an MOU last year based on the old rule. We're in the process of reaching out to the Corps of Engineers to revise that rule. The second thing I'll say that's relevant to the permit writers is it allows inclusion of the whole of the project in an explicit way. That's been something that has been an area of contention as applicants are looking at, trying to get their project across the finish line and have been unhappy with the water boards looking at areas outside of the in-water impact. So there's some additional flexibility there. And again, that's aligns pretty well with what we've put in our dredger fill procedures. The last thing that I want to mention is that there's additional flexibility for certification changes. This is really a return to status quo. There are some certain process efficiencies that we use that we can continue to use as WDRs, and now we can also use them again for 401 certifications. I won't go into details on those, but your staff are going to get a lot of that. Next slide. I want to talk briefly about NPDES permits. Here, I'm talking a little bit out of my program expertise, so I'm towing pretty close to the line of what I've talked to the attorneys about. So I think the key piece here is that the discharges of pollutants may still need an NPDES permit. We have some ability there to assert that an NPDES permit is needed even if the immediate point of discharge isn't a water of the US. Basically, there's some options there for determining it. One is that it has to be a functional equivalent of a direct discharge. I think that this may have been missed yesterday, but there's some additional legal cases that I won't go into. Suffice it to say that there's some guidelines there. If you run into a case where you have a discharge going into a non-water of the state and you have an applicant that is challenging your jurisdiction, that's a good time to pick up the phone with the attorneys, and you're probably going to get the answer that you want to get. So we do expect to continue issuing NPDES permits when requested. We do expect that there's going to be some interesting case law that comes out of this. Time will tell. And again, if an NPDES permit isn't required, we still have the ability to permit this under our WDR permit authority. We are in talks with our stormwater folks to see whether or not we need to develop WDRs for things like the construction and industrial work. Next slide. Okay, there's been a lot of interest about NPDES stormwater permits. Again, similar to the NPDES, the same principles apply to NPDES permits, still generally apply to the NPDES stormwater permits. The statewide permits, the statewide NPDES permits such as Caltrans, the MS4s, and the phase 1 and 2 and phase 1, 2, MS4 permits. So those generally transmit to a water of the US. So we don't really expect a whole lot of change there. Similarly, the IGP generally discharged to an MS4. So probably not a lot of change there. Where we see a potential issue is with the construction general permits, because those are temporary and transient and they're harder to track. We're still learning whether there will be new watersheds without any waters of the United States post-Sackett. An important thing to note here is when a discharger comes and says this isn't a water of the US, we don't have legal authority to say yes or no. That's a function of the federal government. So the response to the applicant would be, well, you need to go talk to the coroner, one of the appropriate agencies, and go get a jurisdictional determination. And again, if you do come to the point where no NPDES permits required, you still have the WDR route open to you. Next slide. The last one, and I won't say a whole lot about this, is the integrated report. Basically, the way the integrated report and our listing policy is structured, it's focused only on waters of the US. We are going to defer to the federal agencies as to jurisdictional status. We are not intending to use the integrated report to make jurisdictional decisions. And I think I'm going to stop there and hand over to Patrick.
All right, next slide. I feel like a lot of these presentations are almost stages of grief, kind of counseling for everybody here. We're going through anger, denial, and hopefully my presentation will be a little bit of the acceptance phase. You know, we have this decision. It's now upon us. What are we going to do to fix it? What are we going to do to continue to protect waters throughout the state? I think the underlying thing that I think we want to underscore over and over again is all waters of the state, regardless of federal jurisdiction, remain under the authority of the regional boards and the state water board. We can protect every single water in the state of California. The procedures for developing waste discharge requirements, non-federal permits, are a little different, as Paul and the legal panel yesterday said. But I do want to say that here in the Central Valley, we have more of the state-centered waste discharge requirements than all of the other regions combined, whether it's wineries, dairies, food processors, all these little POTWs that discharge to spray fields within our region. So it can be done. We have a lot of familiarity processing these permits and getting them issued. And the process for issuing a 401 certification as waste discharge requirements, it's the same process, you know. So there is a body of expertise that has been developed at the state level, and certainly, you know, Karen, as you work through the winery general order and other things, we do have this expertise and we absolutely have this authority. That said, the kind of areas that were principally going to be affected by a Sackett decision, at least from the Central Valley Water Board's perspective, and I'm so glad the law professor agreed with this slide yesterday, because I submitted the slides way before he came in, was the 401 certifications program primarily, and the 404 program on the federal side, stormwater program, and then the NPDES point source permitting program. Next slide. So the 401 certifications program, you know, we have not, and I think this kind of goes to Paul's point that all of this is still under development. We haven't seen a significant drop off yet because Sackett is quite recent. And that graph right there, it tends to show that the 401 certifications here in the Central Valley are very, very variable based off of the time of year, based off of the type of market conditions that are out there. And so it's hard to discern what at this point is due to Sackett, how many people are trying to say, well, we don't need a permit for this type of activity anymore. And, you know, come and catch us if we need a state authority permit. So we're not quite sure what's happening just yet. Next slide. And a couple images that you see here are some of the things that year over year can have dramatic impacts on the number and type of water quality certifications that we process in the Central Valley. That lower image is of a boat dock in Lake Oroville. We had to issue multiple water quality certifications, probably dozens of them, to many of the lakes and reservoirs in our region because they all, the level of the lake fell below where the boat ramps reached, and some of those are houseboats there. People could not reach their houseboats. And so we issued literally dozens of water quality certifications in the drought to extend boat ramps. On the top is levee repairs here in the Sacramento region. When you have flooding, you have, literally dozens, if not hundreds of water quality certifications issued and waivers issued for levee repairs and for clean outs of intake structures and other types of operations in that area. So it's really hard to determine, add that to the housing market and all the construction projects. Don't really know kind of where the variability due to SACIT is in the picture just yet. But that said, we have a 401 water quality certifications program that is very used to wide swings in the types of permits that they issued and the volume of permits that they issue. Next slide. And here's a little bit about the process differences between issuing a 401 water quality certification, waste discharge requirements. Long story short, it takes a lot longer to issue waste discharge requirements than a 401 water quality certification. I'm going back to something that the law professor said yesterday, I think Paul alluded to as well. When you're issuing a water quality certification, one of the reasons that the public engagement is a little dialed down is because you're really not issuing the permit. The Corps is issuing the permit. You're regulating this under a general permit that the Corps has out there. And really, you're just adding those water quality certification conditions on top of that permit. When the state is acting under Water Code Section 13263 and issuing waste discharge requirements is what you have to do when it's non-jurisdictional, you're putting together the whole package. So instead of a 30-day kind of pre-consultation, here's what's going to be in your water quality certification, here's what's in your permit, the board staff are really going to structure the entire package itself, from what you're going to be doing to operate the permit, how is it going to work, what are most importantly, what are the water quality certifications going to be? And then the reason why there's a lot of variability in that last component, you got to take it to a board meeting. And so that's a little different than the 401 water quality certifications, which largely happen outside of the purview of the boards. It's you entrust your executive officers to sign off on most of the water quality certifications. We can't do that with waste discharge requirements. That can lead to some hiccups. That can mean that there's a little bit longer delay as we're waiting for a public comment period to line up with a board meeting. Next slide. But I think there are a lot of areas in which we've had some practice in figuring out ways to streamline the process to issue these permits. This is a case study. Again, the law professor alluded to one of the habitat conservation plans in the East Bay. This is our big habitat conservation plan. There's multiple others kind of in development statewide. I know Southern California has a few. We have a fair amount of big ones happening within our region as well. And essentially what we did with this kind of habitat conservation plan that essentially structured how development was going to be in this huge swath of land within Placer County was we adopted a waste discharge requirement / general water quality certification for this huge regional approach to development within our region. And it really adopts what has been deemed yesterday as the mitigation hierarchy, right? You avoid wetlands impacts, you mitigate wetlands impacts, you compensate where you can't avoid or mitigate. And essentially what this package does is it allowed development to happen in Placer County in a very structured way. And so if a project proponent came forward and said, well, we're going to bulldoze some wetlands here, what can we do? What's the compensation package? We have virtually off the shelf, we can say, here's what we can do. Here's how you can work to restore wetlands. There's integrated wildlife corridors. There's more, high value wetlands that are part of this grand plan that you can do to have your development project move forward and offset that development with more enhanced environmental benefits in other areas of this county. And it goes through a huge interagency review team, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, US EPA, Central Valley Water Board, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, CDFW, in addition to a handful of local agencies, all participate in that and really have an in-depth understanding of the type of wildlife and species benefits that would occur due to this compensation package. And we adopted this permit as a joint WDR's water quality certification, basically saying we really don't care if it's federally jurisdictional or not. it all has to be part of the package, whether it's a state, WARS of the state, WARS of the US, it's going to be compensated for. We use the dredge and fill procedures and really a significant success story within our region getting this across the line. As mentioned yesterday, huge effort. This is a decade plus in the making for this particular project. Next slide. This is some of the waterways that are kind of the integrated wildlife corridors that are protected under this Placer County Habitat Conservation Plan. Next slide. And going into industrial and construction stormwater. So certainly there's a huge industrial and construction stormwater workload in the Central Valley, as with many of your regions as well. I will say, realistically, we are not seeing a lot of sites with construction stormwater or industrial stormwater sites say, all right, Sackett came around, we don't need a permit anymore. We're not seeing that just yet. Frankly, on a construction standpoint, I talked to the building industry here in this region, and they say, why would we jeopardize a $100 million, $300 million project, that might or might not be jurisdictional? Go back to the core, get the jurisdiction, maybe face a citizen suit if we guessed wrong. Let's just go with our kind of initial jurisdictional determination, figure out what this project is going to do, mitigate to the extent practicable, and move forward with that. I don't know if that will be the case in the future. These projects are usually years, if not decades, in development. So we may see some changes here, but we're not seeing changes off the bat. And same with industrial stormwater. You guess wrong, and guess who's knocking on your door? It's one of our local NGOs or a regional board enforcement action saying, well, we got a $25,000 penalty per day for your violation. You guessed wrong. You thought it was non-jurisdictional. Guess what? It's jurisdictional. You're out of business, essentially. So we're not seeing a lot of business owners within our region gamble on that just yet, which again blunts some of the impact of Sackett, at least on at the initial years. Next slide. And so that's, again, construction stormwater. This was settled. They paid the price. Next slide. So I want to talk, I was hired, and for those of you who don't know, I was hired Office Chief Counsel in 2007. It was a good year. Jen Fordyce was hired right before me. So hired some good attorneys right around that time period. And at the time, as Phil mentioned yesterday, there was a lot of discussion, even here at WQCC, about a major Supreme Court case that significantly changed the jurisdictional determinations in the state of California. And, at the time, there was this 2004 enforcement case that was kind of winding its way through the regional board enforcement, and you'd hear echoes today of exactly what these project proponents were saying at the time. In the background there, you can see that kind of, a green stripe towards the horizon. That's the Feather River. This is a construction project in Butte County that the regional board saw this piece of land getting torn up, nestled right between the Thermalito Forebay, Thermalito Afterbay, huge rice kind of area of the state. And they didn't have a construction stormwater permit. And it's kind of obscure as to why they didn't have a construction stormwater permit, but they sure as heck kind of latched on to Rapanos and said, well, we don't need a construction stormwater permit. This stuff isn't jurisdictional anymore. But, again, Phil Wiles was kind of one of the folks who helped litigate this permit. The regional board won this enforcement case. Next slide. We saw turbid water coming off of this property, and we saw turbid water coming off to this property onto some properties that may or may not have been jurisdictional. But the water bodies that they headed into, that turbid water was eventually destined for, sure as heck was jurisdictional. So we litigated this case, and it's in Butte County, and we went to the appeal, and eventually resulted in a decision that said, regardless of whether these drainage issues, the potentially non-jurisdictional water bodies themselves constitute waters of the United States, the regional board was absolutely justified in imposing, I think what the time was, $250,000 penalty for the discharges of this unpermitted site that didn't receive construction stormwater permit. You are justified, regional board, go ahead and collect that, that penalty amount. And I remember as a new attorney, I had a blast going on and filing judgment liens against this guy all throughout Butte County, making sure that he did pay the penalties imposed by the regional board. There was a little bit more legwork. I think Yvonne alluded to that yesterday, and thankfully our enforcement staff did the legwork with this permit. So they actually had to take a look, not just at where this pipe was headed, but a little further downstream as well. And thankfully, that's something that your enforcement teams regularly do. They don't just kind of leave it as, all right, we got the turbid water coming out of the pipe. They usually do those inspections to kind of put that in a bigger context as part of this construction, industrial stormwater inspection. So they're generally in a good case to even frame up enforcement cases, even if there is a jurisdictional kind of opposition coming from the party that got caught red-handed polluting waters of the state or waters of the US. Next slide. And lastly, kind of in our NPDES permitting area, we've got a lot of these, about 100 POTWs in our region, about 20 hatcheries, got a number of others, about 50 more groundwater extraction treatment systems that discharge to waters of the US. NPDES permit manager kind of right off the bat, when SACIT came around, we said, take a look at all those permits. You think there's any whiff that any of those receiving water bodies would be non-jurisdictional under the new SACIT rule? And they said, every single one of those, mostly Sacramento River, Feather River, water bodies that are permanent water bodies, you're not seeing. Some of them are effluent dominated, so they're just a trickle of times of the year. But there's virtually no risk, at least kind of our internal risk assessment of any of those NPDES permits not being jurisdictional. We've had some conversations, obviously, with the Corps, and they say, even under these new regulations, these would all still be NPDES permits that you're used to issuing. Not much would change in that area. Again, I'm sure there's going to be somebody who pushes the envelope, but we're not kind of anticipating huge kind of disruptions within this program either. Next slide. And last but not least, a couple other considerations within our region. We've had some comments coming in. Well, why don't you fix that with your basin plan to determine what waters are jurisdictional within our basin plan? I tell a lot of new board members within our region, how many waterways do you have within our region? And that my easy response is, well, Sacramento to New York. And they're like, wow, that's a huge, that many miles of water bodies. Well, it's like, no, it's actually Sacramento to New York, and then back to Sacramento, and then back to New York, and then back to Sacramento. We have about 11,000 plus miles of surface water bodies in the Central Valley. Absolutely not all of them are well described within our basin plan. Certainly that's kind of the risk under SACIT. Some of those tributaries are not well enough defined to be jurisdictional. But it's one of those things where, the length and breadth of our waterways, we just don't necessarily have the resources to go in and work with the Corps to make jurisdictional determinations off of all those water bodies, much less all the wetlands that are next to them. So I don't anticipate huge changes within our basin planning program. That flooding that you see there, that's flooding in Elk Grove from the Cosumnes River. We have the Nashville Dam mentioned in our basin plan. Has anybody heard of the Nashville Dam? Never was built. It was included in our basin plan when it was adopted in 1975. At the time, it was still the major dam on the Cosumnes River. The Cosumnes River, as you may know, has no large major dams on it. It's kind of a point of pride. Means that Elk Grove gets flooded and every once in a while, and we really have to kind of bolster some of the flood control within the lower reaches of that river. But it still exists in our basin plan. So if we hadn't had the time to kind of go back and revise that, we certainly don't have the time to go back with a handful of basin planning staff and address the 11,000 plus miles of waterways that we have within our region. And last but not least, two of the huge programs, as you heard from yesterday, that have very, very significant water quality impacts within our region are the dairy program and the irrigated lands regulatory program. Just massive kind of regulatory efforts here in the Central Valley. Neither one of them is very significantly affected by the Sackett decision because largely they're exempt from Clean Water Act under the irrigated land certainly is under the exception there. And although confined animal feeding operations are certainly something that the federal rules touch, virtually all of the dairies within our region took great pains to relocate, actually outside of Southern California back into the Central Valley and stay the heck away from surface water bodies. So they've really tried to disconnect themselves from jurisdictional waterways because they faced just crushing citizen suits, and that's appropriately so, decades ago. So again, those are areas within the Central Valley that are just largely untouched by the Sackett ruling. Next slide. There's one more picture. Yeah, that's again one of the water bodies. It's water that's monitored as a water of the U.S. and they don't have any plans on changing that under the irrigated lands program. That is dry. They still monitor that for pesticides and will be monitoring that in the future for pesticides. And a variety of other water quality parameters. And that's it from me.
So
back to information.
Before we go to questions, I just want to take a minute to kind of summarize what you heard. There's a lot of information there. I think that the take-home message for you all to think about is we have 1,000 to 1,500 very small 401 certifications that are normally done through the Army Corps. Some portion of those are no longer going to be jurisdictional, are going to require permits. Each one of those permits is going to need to come to the regional board for an adoption. That is an increase in workload. And remember that most of these are either infrastructure projects like repairing utility corridors or highway repairs or pipelines or housing developments. They all have very short timelines and they are going to be very unhappy. So we are working towards developing a general permit to mirror the Army Corps' nationwide permits for those waters that come out so that we can allow for a process that for those small, most of these are very small impacts, 1/10 of an acre, less, if we can get those in a general permit, we can focus your efforts on the larger projects that are more complicated and need more analysis. So that's one big piece to take home. We're moving forward to try and solve that recognized problem. But in the short term, as the jurisdictional things come up, maybe in the next year or so, we will see some of these. As Patrick mentioned, a lot of folks are just not pushing the envelope at this moment. But as the case law develops and as people push it around the country, we may see some more of that coming forward. We don't really know why yet. Another piece of that puzzle is getting your staff trained up, getting our staff trained up to do those jurisdictional. We're in the process of figuring that out and getting that for all of you. We recognize that's going to be an increased workload. We recognize it's an area that we don't have the expertise. We did ask the Army Corps, given that you're not going to be doing this in many of the waters, can we work out some interagency agreement? They said no. They're happy to keep their staff and they're not interested in giving any or having any of them come work for us. But we will work with them on training and development so that our staff can do it. We also recognize that there are some areas in the state that pride themselves on small government and are going to latch on to the idea that this allows them to do dredge and fill activities or discharges without a permit. We are going to need folks on the ground to be verifying that, making sure that we're not people aren't taking advantage of it. Not sure how many that'll be, not sure how big, but we are creating the tools so that if we have to go to state permits for, say, construction stormwater, we will have a companion construction stormwater permit that applies to state-only waters. All of this is in process, but we have recognized the impact on all of you and are trying to mitigate that as best we can, but it will mean more board time for more permits that we have to take into consideration. Thank you. I just wanted to do a quick summary for you all.
Thank you for that, John. I think the reality is that there are a lot of efficiencies we know that have been built into the permitting work that we've all become accustomed to, and the balance of both the federal resources it takes to get the work done in the state, and that's now been upset. And it's about filling that hole, that expertise, as John said, and also figuring out how we continue to innovate across this, because the burden is more on us now. We aren't over-resourced. We never will be over-resourced. And so we really need to be thinking about our programs in light of, then again, these new obligations that were otherwise under federal purview. And then, the timelines, as Patrick helpfully showed, alone are of concern when it comes to what the regulated community has really come to expect in their ability to get in, as you heard, which is critical infrastructure right now. There's a huge streamlining discussion on infrastructure. This has a potential to really harm those desires to try to do, more faster, especially with, the timelines we have on certain federal dollars. This all kind of comes to rest here within our space. And so I just really appreciate the leadership and, again, expertise that will all come to bear in being able to address this. Let's go to questions. Norma, or Eric, and then Norma. No, you can start, Eric. Go ahead and start. Thank you. Good morning.
Oh, Patrick, I was really delighted to hear that you're not going to do this SACIT is not going to affect very much what ongoing agriculture is going to do. So let me finish. So that when Fish and Wildlife tells the farmer not to plow a field, you guys could say, don't worry about it.
Well, again, I think the challenge absolutely is that the state authorities, whether it's a state California Fish and Wildlife, and they're talking about whether it's red-winged blackbirds or some other sensitive species, they're still there. They're still going to be saying you got to protect that species. It's virtually no retraction. I do think one of the points that kind of was raised, and I think Paul got to it in some of the issues yesterday, when it comes to species protection, one of the challenges is that when you do have the federal nexus, it automatically triggers the section 7 consultation in many contexts, especially when it doesn't fall under one of the small kind of don't worry about it general order provisions under the Army Corps. And I think that's one of those areas that we'll continue to look at very closely to make sure that the species protections are maintained, because that's one of the reasons we protect the water in the first place.
Oh, the red-winged blackbird voluntary program is still working?
I think so. I think so. I mean, the dairy guys still tell us that they have their alfalfa grown high because there's red-winged blackbirds there that time of year.
Thank you, Eric. Norma.
Yeah. This is a huge change. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around this as well, too. But what happens to existing permits that are currently in play, like larger infrastructure projects? And, with the 401 CERT, there was compensatory mitigation that was rolled into those projects too. What happens to that, and how does that all work out?
So I think what we've seen, at least, is there's not a single developer saying, "Oh, Army Corps, kind of redo our permit and set us back to zero on that." It's kind of when you have that investment and when you have resources mobilized, whether it's construction or consultants or every type of mitigation that you have under your CEQA document, NEPA document, what we're hearing is that nobody wants to kind of second guess that and potentially have everything scrambled up and set the project back a number of years. Particularly with the thought that interest rates might go higher. So there's certainly a rush to kind of get things done. I think many of these impacts, it's still a wait and see. Still wait and see, and let's see how the Army Corps reacts to this. And just like any other significant state or federal agency, it takes a while to turn the battleship around. And certainly there are institutional cultures that will run cross current to kind of changing things. So change is usually pretty slow in these areas, even though the Supreme Court can make change happen pretty fast. It takes a little while to ripple down. So we're not seeing huge effects yet. Jury's out as to whether they'll come in years to come.
Yeah, and I was wondering, also, when you're dealing with permitted operation and maintenance projects like levy maintenance projects, long-term O&M, and mitigation associated with that, has anything come up, or is that going to be impacted?
That's one of the interesting areas. I mean, especially as you go further down within our region, I can just speak for our region because Paul noted is all the regions look crazy different in terms of like the amount of and when the 401s get filed and paid for and stuff like that. But I think one of the areas that we're watching very closely is there's a lot of kind of ag inlets and ag levees and other stuff like that, especially in the southern parts of our region that, jurisdictional, just to be completely honest, and I know this is public, but I've said it public before, but just to be completely honest, some of the jurisdictional lines have been blurry at best in the past, at least ever since Rapanos, maybe even dating back to Swankin before that. So that's one area that we're watching very carefully. If there's an irrigation district that wants to do a clean out project, I fundamentally, and it's kind of what John alluded to. There are people that want to push that are going to want to push the envelope. I think it's vital that our staff, in our Fresno office and our Reading office and kind of the more independent-minded areas of the state, shall we say, maintain relationships with the irrigation districts, maintain relationships with leaders within the agricultural community, within other communities, municipalities, so that, they can have those conversations before anything builds to a head. And I'm sure, within your regional boards, you're authorizing staff time for your leadership to go out there and speak with, building industry, construction industry, different industrial sources, and to say, well, is this the gamble that you want to take, or can we kind of take it slow and see how this develops?
And just one last question, I'll be quiet. You talk about your HCP, your Habitat Conservation Plan, and it sounds like that no modifications needed to be done, and the plan continues to provide coverage for those projects.
Absolutely. And I will say, even though that was a major effort, that it's kind of like that was a master permit. Individual projects within that permit have had to come before the board. If the project reaches a certain size or there's a type of mitigation that needs to be involved, it's not just, hey, this, we're forgetting about those 26,000 or 262,000 acres in Placer County. We're done with that. When there are large developments within that kind of watershed, even within that plan, they come back to us. But the idea is that it's a much more streamlined review, and the recipe is already there, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel as we're permitting those projects within the context of that plan.
Thank you for that, Norma, and never need to be quiet. We actually have about an hour here for discussion, so everyone should really dig in.
So keep going, Norma. I could all day.
What's next? Really appreciate that. The mic may be up, probably.
Karen, you had mentioned the goal of expanding our capacity to address this workload. And I was thinking in two ways. One, I'm not sure that our salary structure supports hiring a large number of field biologists to do jurisdictional determinations. When you think about what one could earn outside state service or outside federal service, or the flip side is if you were to bring in a junior biologist, I think it would take 3 or 4 years to make that person into someone you could send out to do moderately complex jurisdictional determinations. So I feel that capacity is going to take years to build. And in the meantime, knowing how favorably Department of Finance looks at budget change proposals, I'm worried, might there be the option of some contract capacity in the interim and in the context of a budget change proposal, perhaps, that would begin to build up the staffing and marry it up with, and I know contracting is not instant putting either page on. So I'm hopeful that we can have some tools and not just assume that we could hire someone and train them and go do. Thank you.
A couple of quick comments. One is we won't talk about budget change proposals or here because that's a internal discussion with the Department of Finance and the governor's office. So I won't get into that. But I will say that we have we run into a lot of difficulties generally about contracting something that could be done by a state employee. Alexis, you know that when we were looking at helping our MPDS permitting, we needed to do in lieu contracts with the EPA because we couldn't contract for work that we could do by state agency. It's just against state law. And so it's a very difficult position for us to be in. I would say the good news is that we're not expecting to do a lot of original jurisdictional determinations. We are looking to be reviewing jurisdictions that the contractors that the proponent develops, which is a little bit easier, but you still need that expertise that we're going to have to be building. And I agree with you, it's going to take time to build that.
Can I add to that, John?
Yeah.
We've also got commitments from US EPA to assist with building the capacity within our staff and training. You're right, it's going to take some time. It's not easy to recruit right now either. So, you're pointing to a really big challenge that we're going to need to face and work through, but we do have support from US EPA Region 9 moving forward too.
And I'll add, I think fundamentally, the Corps is maintaining their jurisdictional determination kind of, the kingdom, shall I say. It's interesting. You read the water code, and there's that line that says that's on the Clean Water Act, Port of Cologne kind of component, and says, state can issue 404 permits. And as a new attorney, you kind of read through that, and you're like, we can. And then US EPA has never delegated that authority to the regional boards, and I don't think that's going to change. At least, kind of the initial conversations are. But I think to your point, I think the expertise that is lacking is in doing that work in those areas that were formerly jurisdictional. The type of biological assessments in those wetlands areas, as kind of Paul's team, found out when they developed the dredge and fill procedures, is, I don't want to say fundamentally different, but qualitatively different than the type of work that we do in other program areas. And so building that expertise in those fringe areas, figuring out what are the water quality parameters that we want to protect for, how do we ensure that downstream impacts are not seen from these projects. That's something that the Corps has been developing for decades. And that shift will come to the regional boards and state board to make sure that we have that expertise on hand from just from a water quality perspective. So I mean, it's going to be a wild ride, but it'll be interesting to see how that develops, and certainly recruitment plays a big part of that.
Yeah, I have some good news on that front too. Some of the writing has been on the wall for a while now about this. So we have been making sure, like with the dredge or fill procedures, we made sure to develop it in a way that we could have the same process regardless of where the jurisdiction lied. In a similar fashion, we've recognized the need for training. And so last year we worked with the Training Academy, and we actually have a contract with an external trainer. Last year it was one of the people that actually was one of the primary authors of the delineation procedures that the Corps uses. So, we're going right to the source, and we're providing this training to our staff. So we already have training elements in place. We intend to continue those. So yeah, certainly it's going to take some years of capacity development, but we're already getting it started.
Great, thank you. Jean-Pierre.
Thank you. So Jean-Pierre, so,
Your mic may have gone off. Apologies, Jean-Pierre. If it's green, it should. Oh, it's flashing. Yeah, we'll get you another mic. Here, Mike has another mic. Thanks, Michael.
All right, now we're on. So, I reflected on our conversation, and rightfully so, we focus on the legal interpretation, the regulatory compliance, etc. But there's a large group of stakeholders that can be impacted, and those are the funding agencies for environmental projects. So I'm going to give you a very specific example. In agriculture land, as you well know, there are many projects which are funded through the Natural Resource Conservation Services. That's USDA, Now that's federal funding. The implementation is done through VRCDs, Resource Conservation Districts, which are special districts of the state of California and follows state guidelines. So the funding is a flow through from the NRCS to VRCDs. Then typically what is used is looking at the term blue line stream, which I think that interpretation now can be viewed in different perspectives, and navigable water as another interpretation as well. So sometime depending if a project, falls in these different categories, the fundings can be impacted. Because, we look at it rightfully so, 401 certification, you come to us, we make sure you do the right thing. But I think it's gonna be a bit of a learning curve also. And to your point, Paul, I'll call it the educational component with all these funding agencies, and many of them, as you know, are NGOs also, where they are getting the funding, matching funds, 1 + 1, 2, so we can make it a go. So I was just reflecting on that, that's another little piece of a story for environmental beneficial projects that, it's gonna be a little bit of a learning curve. So thank you.
No, absolutely. I think, when SACA came through and when we were talking about it, one of the things that we took a look at was certain grant projects that we were working on or involved with for the review. I think, at least in terms of what we have on the books today, and that includes the 319H grants and other kind of components that we see out there, including, natural resource conservation, it all seems to be still jurisdictional. But I think you do raise a good point that there may be a reprioritization of some of those projects, particularly in fringe areas, shall I call them, where you have not quite clear jurisdiction for federal waters, and whether the grant funding agencies decide to kind of reprioritize based on that. There is some prioritization of grant funding based on water quality limited segments under 303D, and so to the extent that the scope of the 303D list is kind of curtailed a little bit. We could see some impacts there. The scope of which I don't think is the majority of projects by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that there could be some action in that area, and maybe there's a couple projects statewide that would not get funding now that there's not in a jurisdictional water or watershed that would be connected to a jurisdictional water where they would have 5 or 6 years ago. So, but I don't know for sure yet. Exactly.
Yeah, I can shed a little light on that too, because that was one of the thought process that I had was, what does this do to our 319H? And that's the only grant fund I can speak to. But we did reach out to US EPA and said, hey, what do you guys think about this? Do you guys have any thoughts about it? And the response that I got, which I understand came from headquarters, was a very clear, no, our 319 program funding is intended to go both to federal and non-federal waters. So for at least that grant fund, that I think we're in secure territory. I think what Patrick mentioned, that there may be some indirect effects that relate to listing policy decisions and impairments, impairment TMDL development.
And I think it's because fundamentally, as Paul kind of alluded to, 319H takes a watershed-based approach, and as does the NRCS kind of project. So it's like, well, it's not jurisdictional, maybe right where you land, but it makes its way into a jurisdictional water at some point. So because it is a watershed, and both are kind of have a watershed focus, I think we're pretty safe. But again, we can't tell the future. There may be some small shifts in both of those.
Really appreciate that point, Jean-Pierre. And I think that continuing to keep an eye on these other implications is really important. I think Dave said it yesterday. The courts didn't think about all of this. And, unfortunately, we're all left to figure out, what's left by pretty broad ruling on their part. Other questions? Ben.
Okay, so now that you've gone through the grieving and acceptance phase, one of the next phases might be, is there a silver lining to any of this for us? And so what I'm going to ask is in scenarios where the Corps has determined that it's not jurisdictional or hasn't done anything in terms of jurisdiction, would there be a scenario in which, and have you thought about a scenario in which we wouldn't issue WDRs because of the de minimis or low threat nature of the activity? And essentially, I ask this because the southern portion of Region 6 is desert, it's quite dry. There's probably portions of 7 and 8 that are in the similar situation. And so, and then Jonathan spoke about mitigation, and he was talking about it in terms of a few things, but also staff resources. And then, even in John Pierre's question, I see, perhaps, and having worked on ranch lands and familiar with the permitting for those types of projects, I've seen scenarios in which, we might consider, not issuing a WDR based on the low threat or de minimis nature. So that's my question.
I think I've got a bit of an answer for you. And I think there is a silver lining. Maybe it's not quite silver, maybe it's bronze or brass or not that shiny. But, as I mentioned, in the Central Valley, we have a tremendous amount of waste discharge requirements, of those state permits. And we've known for years, if not decades, that those are clunkier to issue than they should be. And have developed an incredible backlog of those permits. And I think that's the unfortunate story. We have some permits regulating little tiny publicly owned treatment works with spray fields that go back 30 years, and those permits have not been touched in those 30 years. And it's relatively de minimis, and they pay their fee every year. But I think we'd like to update those, right? And so I think that this broader conversation that the whole state is having about how do we streamline and make waste discharge requirements more efficient to issue is a good thing. It's good to have that conversation because there's a lot of areas in the state that need to be brought up to 2023 regulatory standards, regardless of whether they're dealing with groundwater or surface water, jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional. So to the extent that that conversation is happening, I think that's a bit of a silver lining. And in terms of a low threat kind of component, I would point to the fact that our irrigated lands regulatory program, quite recently did a couple of things that are anathema to some regulators, and that we decided not to regulate some stuff that was previously regulated. And it's a very, very small subset of our irrigated lands program, but there were certain watersheds, sub-watersheds, really sub-watersheds, within Goose Lake and within some of the which is way the heck at the northern Oregon border, and a couple other areas where at least the activities that we were regulating for over 10 years weren't showing a single water quality impact. And these are areas where they weren't applying pesticides, had adequate demonstrations from regional board staff going up there. And we said, look, this really is a low threat. We're going to exempt you from the irrigated lands regulatory program. Very, very kind of limited areas, but essentially a significant kind of a marker in that we kind of said we've got limited resources and we want to focus on those areas that are higher impact within those watersheds. So I think that will likely happen within this, and there's a little bit more flexibility to do that under state rules than there is under the federal rules, just kind of fundamentally. And it is interesting to kind of the Supreme Court wasn't thinking about some of this stuff. I know building industry before SACIT came out asked me some questions and kind of spoke at one of their forums, and a couple of them pulled me aside and said, well, what do you think about the SACIT thing that's coming? And I listened to the oral argument at that point, and I didn't think it was going to be as bad as it was, just to be honest, because I was paying attention to what Brett Kavanaugh was saying, and he was kind of definitely not a beacon of liberal thought, on the Supreme Court by any stretch of the imagination. And he was kind of saying, well, there's all these watersheds in the arid West that, if we went with what you're saying, the kind of Sackett attorneys, that would change the rules for them. And lo and behold, Kavanaugh was on the minority for that decision. His kind of thought about what do you do about the arid West did not win the day. And so, we're left with a changing regulatory landscape once again, and I think we have to have those conversations. Like I said, the silver lining is that we need to kind of rethink some things at the state level. And I know that thought process is going on at many levels, legislature, state board, regional board. So that's a good thing. It's healthy to kind of have those discussions every once in a while.
Yeah, I'll throw in there too that, one of the things that we've recognized within the Dredge Fill program, at least, is that we need to turn more of our attention to the development of general orders. And so that's something that we have been investing heavily in at the state board, is trying to figure out how to get those general orders in place. This last year, we did the statewide restoration general order, which I understand has been used in over 40-ish projects since its adoption last spring. That's one thing that we're doing. John talked about trying to come up with WDRs that match the nationwide permits. The vast majority of our permits are done through, the vast number of our certifications are done through the nationwide permit program. Having a similar WDR for that will help to alleviate regional board resources and help them focus on the priority areas, as John mentioned. The one thing I'll say as a cautionary note is keep in mind that when we talk about wetlands, at least, there's a little bit of a death by 1,000 cuts, in that when we did the dredge fill procedures, we took a look at, what's the breakdown of projects. And I was a little surprised to find out that, and it's been a few years. So it's on the realm of about 60% of the projects are 0.2 acres or less, or wetland impact. So the typical wetland project is a very small project by its very nature. So there's some discussion to be had about what de minimis means. And I certainly would love to have more opportunities to do the kind of waivers that Patrick's talking about. But I'm also cautious about, recognizing that there's a lot of de minimis work going on out there.
I think I remember when you had that discussion at the state board, it said, and it might have been in this room, it says 0.2 acres, about the size of this room, Yeah. So, relatively minor, but I second that.
Yes, Norma Camacho again from Region 2. Sorry. But I know we talked a lot about education and training for staff, but I think it's really important for us to kind of get our talking points together and get out in the community to the building industry associations, to municipalities who have question marks before others get out to them and provide, let's say, maybe perhaps a different interpretation of what this all means. And then we would have to try to go back and undo a lot of that. and it's like doubling the work. So I'm just wondering, is there going to be guidance for individual regions from the state to develop some type of template so that we're all saying the same things from region to region in terms of interpretation?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I mentioned that we have our water quality certification roundtable that's going on right now. And one of the things they're talking about today is to kind of break down, to do a similar to what we've done over the last couple of days, is to sit down with the regional boards and say, okay, this is what we're seeing are the critical differences. These are the kind of things that you need to be considering as you go through your permitting process. We're looking at updating our permit templates that are available to the regional boards to be able to meet the Sackett requirements. We have met now with, we have met or have scheduled meetings with the NGO community, with the building association, and there's one other that I'm forgetting. So yes, we are actively pursuing that. don't know. I'd have to talk to Serena. I think there's some discussion about putting together an FAQ.
Paul, there actually is an FAQ and it's posted, it's in your WQCC materials and it's actually posted on the SACIT website. So I think the plan is to update those and, it'll be a living document as we get sort of more standard questions. So absolutely, everybody should be talking from the same song sheet. I think that's super important. So use your code, use the email materials that Meredith set out. So we already have like the beginning of that for you.
Yeah, and I just want to caution that let's not take too much time to make it perfect to answer all the questions, and we'll be honest by saying, well, we don't really know the answer, we're researching that, but we have to start the dialogue because silence is our worst enemy right now.
Yeah, there is a certain extent to which we are ourselves waiting for feedback from the US EPA and the Corps of Engineers. We are trying to meet regularly with the Corps as of the moment. They're still trying to figure out where the lay of the land is for them. So we certainly want to make sure that we can get out the information that's available, but we all need to understand that this is a developing area and our guidance is going to have to develop accordingly.
Yeah, I had the pleasure recently of attending the Environmental Council of States for Secretary Garcia. And this was one of the top issues, of course, because, it's not just California that's struggling with these, and we all each have different state laws and different sort of, flavors of kind of political leanings on the issue. And so it was good to hear a lot of the common challenges, though, around the resources. And here, hopefully you're not hearing from the regulated community that there is silence. We are trying to really create these documents and have them out there. And maybe we'll have further discussion, but maybe I think for sure this is one of the things that we should not just follow at the chairs meeting, but create some space here where other regional board members could potentially kind of be part of a group of folks that are being informed by this, but also helping shape it and better, aggregating what you're all hearing from the regulated community, if it's, kind of just question marks or other input. So thank you so much for that, Norma. Really appreciate it. Other questions? And if we've exhausted the topic, looking to the panel, though, if there's anything we should, we have a couple hands up on the platform. Apologize. Let me go to Denise Kadara.
Yes, good morning. My comment, I really appreciate the discussion that we've had on this Hackett policy by the Supreme Court. And I'm glad to know that as we've done our analysis and stuff, that our regional boards are in a fairly good position. My only comment is that, outside of California, we're still a part of the United States, and there's so many other parts of the country that will be impacted by this that don't have the regulatory support that we have within our region. So I'm just, making that as a comment, and I heard your brief discussion, Joaquin. It is an issue that will still have some impact on us as we look at other parts of the regions, and particularly those communities of color and that will not have the support that we currently have within our state. So thank you very much.
Huge thanks for that, Denise. Completely agree. And again, talking to other states, you have, different sorts of reactions, and we're fortunate here for a lot of leadership in California. That dates back to, of course, Porter Cologne itself into the Clean Water Act. But to your point, Denise, connecting with the other states, showing common leadership here and recognizing that, it's not just in California's borders, that our discussions and our work and the tone that we set, sets for others and expectations in other states. So really appreciate that acknowledgement, Denise. Who else do we have on? Oh, David Nahai. Good to see you, David, here virtually.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for a great panel. And I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person today, but I actually wanted to ask this question yesterday, and I still think it pertains today, which is really what, if anything, is going on in the California legislature regarding this? Because yesterday we heard that under the Porter Cologne Act, as wonderful a salvation as it is, there are limitations. For instance, with respect to enforcement, it's more onerous process to to go forward with enforcement. The fines are less than would be under the Clean Water Act. So is there movement within the California legislature to entertain amendments to the Port of Cologne Act that are going to make for a more robust enforcement process, and to perhaps bolster other aspects given the limitations that SACIT is placing on us?
Really appreciate the question, David. In part, we'll respond kind of in the vein of our budget change proposals, where the sort of what we at least advocate for and engage with the legislature. We can have internal discussions around. But I think to your point, though, the legislature created Port of Cologne, passed Port of Cologne, created the water boards, and so I think there's a space for a tremendous amount of leadership. I know there is leadership in the legislature generally around our issues. And the decision just came out in the summer. So, we are new into this space, and here this panel and convening and discussion is in part our opportunity to elevate. And so I appreciate your point, and know that, I know the legislature will continue to be a valued partner of the board, has been the water boards writ large, and but thanks for the consideration and flag there.
Joaquin, can I just add a little bit on that?
Of course, Michael, please.
And
good to see you virtually today.
I'm joining virtually today. Hope all's well. Good to see you, David. I will say the legislature has been very interested in this space. When the Trump administration was trying to roll back the Clean Water Act administratively, the legislature carried some significant legislation that, frankly, in the view of, and this was public at the time, in the view of the state administration, perhaps even overreached a little bit in terms of trying to backstop against federal encroachment or federal retrenchment. The legislature has started to reach out to us. Anna has been terrific in terms of connecting us up with the appropriate committees and with legislative leadership who are interested in fully understanding, just from a technical perspective and a legal perspective, what does the SACIT decision mean? What does the water board have in the way of authorities? What are the gaps, if you will? Much of the same dialogue we've had over the last 2 days, we intend to share, quite frankly, with the legislature. So that conversation is ongoing, and I expect that there will be significant interest from key legislators next year.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Any other folks on the platform, Meredith? Any other questions or comments in the room? There will be a lot more to follow up around all this, and looking forward to that follow-up. Again, there is opportunity. I think there is, silver lining amongst it, but certainly a lot more discussion and a real focus. So looking forward to what I know in the course of this next year will be a lot more discussion on this topic. We can close it out then. We'll take our break early and give ourselves a little space and go ahead and start back up here at 11:45 for our update on the water supply strategy, which was last year's, all-encompassing theme. And this year we get a real good update on implementation. So see you all here at 11:45. Okay, everyone. Thank you for the continued attention over these last 2 days. As you all recall and might recall, last year really focused on the water supply strategy, and it committed us to a good bit of work, and really appreciated the engagement and discussions we're able to have. And now we're wrapping up this year's WQCC with an update. What's gone over the last year, which is a ton, what's going to still continue to unfold, and importantly, how you all continue to be an important part. Your leadership, the permitting discussion we just had around Sackett, all of these things are interconnected, and just really appreciate, importantly, John and Nancy here, their leadership, their work, continue to guide us around all this, and just appreciate the ability to synthesize what's a lot of good direction in the water supply strategy. So without further ado, kick it over to our panel.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I just wanted to say thanks for all the work you do. It's not easy. It's very localized. It's tricky. It's difficult, and you don't get. I mean, it's only a psychic reward that you're getting pretty much for that, and we really need public servants like you. So thank you. I work at the Natural Resources Agency. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Water, so I'm advising the Secretary here and there, just trying to help him as he works with stakeholders in the governor's office and so on. I'm going to put the water supply strategy in context. I'm going to go back very quickly to when Governor Newsom took office in January 2019. A few months after he took office, he issued an executive order that called for a water resilience portfolio. He called on the Natural Resources Agency, the California Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Food and Agriculture to work together to create essentially a water policy blueprint for the state. It's a long executive order. He asked for a whole lot of things in that executive order. He asked for assessments, for example, of water supply and demand for each region and of water quality. He wanted an understanding of all the existing state water related programs. That was no small thing to try to pull together. So I was hired in about May 2019 to help carry that out, the delivery of the water resilience portfolio. We delivered it in July 2020 with an extensive amount of stakeholder engagement, and I could not have done it obviously without Cal EPA and the Water Board right there with me every step. And that document, it came down to 142 separate actions that state agencies, not locals, not individuals, but state agencies were to take on to try to build the kind of California where we don't have people dying or losing property in floods, and we can get through droughts. Excuse me, and that fish and wildlife are protected, and our water is clean and affordable, and everybody's got a supply. So that came out July 2020, and then the drought hit us immediately. We plunged right into drought after we released the water resilience portfolio, and the governor found himself standing in front of dry reservoirs at podiums talking to the press, and it became real clear what the problems were with our water resilient portfolio. It was big, cumbersome, it was comprehensive like the governor called for, but it wasn't pithy, it wasn't catchy, it was not easy to explain to the public, to Californians in the midst of a drought, what our water policy was. And so we all got together, CNRA, Cal EPA, Food and Ag, and DWR and the Water Board. And we pretty quickly, with Jonathan's leadership here, it's tremendous, in a matter of a few weeks, pulled together a second document called the Water Supply Strategy. That's the cover of it there on the slide. And it's only 18 pages long as opposed to the water resilience portfolio, which you could choke a cow with, it weighs a couple pounds. And I know that because I just hauled a bunch of them over here, and there's some on the back table. Please take them if you can.
If you need to choke any cows, the supplies in the back.
So this much more succinct document, it focuses just on one simple premise. If California loses 10% of its water supply by 2040 to hotter, drier conditions, as scientists tell us is possible, how are we going to cope? So this doesn't talk about fish and wildlife. It doesn't talk about a lot of things that are involved in the portfolio, but it does get at how are we going to capture water better when we get it and make it last through the dry years. So put that document out in August 2020. And I think it really did help the administration. It certainly helped bureaucrats like me who had to go talk to folks about what the administration's water policy is. It was easier to grab onto and to describe. And we just last Monday, a week ago, issued a progress report, a 1-year progress report on how we're doing in terms of carrying out the actions in the water supply strategy. There's a lot of targets in that document. And I got to say, thanks to the incredibly wet winter, we're doing great, particularly in groundwater recharge. But I think we would not be doing so well in terms of the recharge that we've captured in this past winter if the water supply strategy starting in August had not forced really hard conversations between the Water Board, DWR, and CDFW about how do you allow for recharge while you're also protecting communities, other water right holders, and fish and wildlife. And I think those conversations help position us to get out the policies and the streamlined permits and so on that allowed for the capture of 3.8 million acre feet of water, not counting natural recharge. So anyway, can you read the slide at all? Because I don't want, you probably cannot, can you? Shoot. All right. So I'm going to have to talk. I apologize. But some of the highlights of our progress report, we, besides the 3.8 million acre feet of recharge, let's see. Now I needed to follow. We also, okay. The water supply strategy calls for essentially the creation of 4 million acre feet of new storage, whether that's above ground or below ground. Part of the biggest chunk of that 4 million acre feet comes from what we call the water storage investment program. Do you all remember back in 2014, there was a water bond, $7.5 billion that the voters passed? Well, of that $7.5 billion, $2.7 billion is supposed to go to pay for the public benefits of new water storage projects. 7 locally driven projects have made it through the hoops so far to be eligible for that $2.7 billion. We hit a milestone last summer when Harvest Water, a groundwater recharge project in South Sacramento County, became the first to get to the point where the Water Commission, which administers this program, is poised to sign a funding agreement and give them their money for their project. We're hoping that 6 other projects can make it through, but they're locally driven and the permitting's tricky. The timelines are long. We have a strike team we created, as was called for in the water supply strategy, to help make sure that DWR, CDFW, and the Water Board are all talking regularly about what these projects need and trying to keep them on track. The governor also, this is a bit of progress, signed legislation to accelerate the judicial review for water storage projects, and one project, Sites Reservoir and Off-Stream Reservoir proposal in Glenn and Colusa counties, has applied to use that judicial streamlining, CEQA judicial review streamlining process, and their documents, I think the public comment period on that closed today. The budget, back when the budget was good and healthy, the last couple of years, we've invested about nearly $9 billion as an administration in water resilience. That includes $100 million for grants to assist dam owners with repairs and rehabilitation. That's a big leap for the state because up until last year, we always said, hey, dam owners, it's your dam, you take care of it. We did not want the state to get into the business of helping locals pay for dam repairs, but it's become clear that the need is so great that state assistance can help leverage federal dollars, which will then help the locals with their repairs. And then one big storage project that's really important to both the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project is the expansion of San Luis Reservoir, which is just south of the Delta. And that's where the water that's diverted from the Delta goes before it's sent down in canals to the South Coast and the San Joaquin Valley. We're trying to expand that reservoir with the federal government, and that project, I'm happy to report, is on track. And those are the highlights. I will mention, next slide, if you don't mind. The one other thing in the water resilience, or excuse me, in the water supply strategy is that we got to do more to improve our forecasting, our water data management, and and just data overall. So DWR, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but DWR has made immense improvements by working with academic and federal partners in terms of understanding how snow is going to run off into reservoirs as it melts in the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Mountain Range, and also the prediction of atmospheric rivers, which bring California most of its water supply. And then we also, in a state that moves water hundreds of miles the way we do, your canal system is incredibly important. And so groundwater overpumping has created subsidence, which has damaged some of the main trunk lines of the canal systems in the San Joaquin Valley. The state and the federal and local governments are stepping up to split the cost of those repairs, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. The good budgets of the last couple of years are allowing us to invest hundreds of millions of dollars of state funds to make those repairs so that the federal government and locals will match. And what that means is that we won't have, once the repairs are made, if the subsidence stops, we won't have the pinch points that limit the movement of water to the San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast. And I'm going to shut up now and turn it over to Jonathan to talk about the great progress on the water board side.
Thank you very much, Nancy. So I know this is the last panel before you all leave and you're all hungry, so I'll try and make it quick. And if you all decide that it's too boring, you can vote with your feet, just kind of walk on out. That's all right. I won't be offended. Could you go next slide, please? So as Nancy said, the water supply strategy is a pretty concise, short document with lots of deliverables. And the water board has a bunch of them, and they're broken into 4 major categories. Develop new water through recycling and desalination, reduce water through conservation, capture more stormwater, and improve our management of water rights. And so this chart just gives you, the general breakdown at 2030 and 2040 of what we're aiming for, what our targets are in each of those. And I'm going to go through the water board's ones quickly, but try and cover where we are and what we're doing. Right up. Next slide, please. Yes. Okay. All right. In terms of recycling, we've got a requirement to adopt direct portable reuse regulations, which is the regulation of taking wastewater directly from the treatment plant and treating it to a high quality and putting it into our water supply system. Those regulations are on schedule to be adopted December 2023. So I think we're going to make that target. And that's a big step. This is, I think, the first in the nation of regulations on how to do that. We have a requirement for a strike team for looking at the obstacles associated with recycled water projects. I think you've all heard the anecdotal stories of the permitting and obstacles and the funding obstacles are to get water recycling projects through. So this is a team made up of your staff, our staff, drinking water. We coordinate with the water reuse and CASA and the NGOs. We're the first part of that strike team, which we convened in January 2023, is to actually get a list of projects that are planned for 2030 and 2040 and start tracking their progress. The team comes together when an issue is identified on those so that we can figure out the solution. What I've heard anecdotally is that there is potential conflict between our drinking water permits and our water recycling permits, and making sure that those folks are talking to each other is part of what that strike team can help identify. There is another problem with recycled water that we are not going to be able to solve, but we at least can highlight, which is that it's very expensive, and we don't have enough money to pay for it all, but at least we can document where there are problems and raise those up to the policymakers for determining when and how we can get more funding for those projects. By January of this year, we are going to have that list of potential projects put together. We've been vetting that with the different organizations. As you can imagine, there's a number of different lists out there. People have their, and they range from these projects are in construction to these are a dream for the future. And so we need to figure out which ones are really on track to try and get done by 2040. And we will have that list together in the next month or so. And next slide, please. We also have been directed to look at desalination projects and the siting and permitting constraints around desalination projects. Jane is here. She lived through some difficult times of trying to permit a large desalination project. So we put together an interagency group that worked for about 8 months to put together a criteria. How can you get to yes quickly with a desalination project and permit? And so that went out for public comment in July of this year and will be released in a final version in the next month or so after some edits from the public comment and that. But one of the next projects that's associated with that coming up next year is, all right, now let's codify those things. There are some recommendations in there to modify our ocean plans desalination requirements. So we will be preparing a basin plan amendment for the State Water Board's consideration. There's also recommendations for MOUs between the major permitting agencies, us, the Coastal Commission, the State Lands Commission, on how can we jointly review and process these permits so that they're not serial and don't take as long to get through that process. And so those actions are coming up in the next year as called for in the water supply strategy. Next slide, please. One of the other areas is stormwater capture. And unlike recycled water, we don't have a good handle on how much stormwater is actually captured and infiltrated around the state. And we don't have a good handle on how much potential there is on the ground. So we have a contract to help us start quantifying that so we can identify where we are and where the potentials are for us to improve that. At the same time, we are trying to simplify and explain and help get more stormwater capture projects through the process. And there are some things that have been identified that we need. We need better definitions of what are dry wells and how do you capture, and are there regulations? Are they different around the state? We also need to figure out, are there ways that we can do essentially stormwater pollution trading so that you can get larger regional projects where you have the land and get in the, pull in the folks that are maybe in the our industrial or our municipal permits that could use that that capacity. And so we're working through those regulations over the next year to figure that out. And next slide, please. And then finally, managing our water rights system in times of scarcity has shown us that it's pretty hard to manage based on data that's 18 months old when it gets reported on an annual basis. And pretty hard to manage when we don't have enough, when we don't get reporting from a large portion of our pre-1914 or riparian water rights users. So we have embarked, and with the support of the administration, on a comprehensive update of our water rights data management. And the governor just signed bill giving us authority to investigate riparian and pre-1914 water rights. We didn't have that ability before. This is all with the idea that if we get real time or closer to real time information on water rights, we can actually use that to manage the system in times of scarcity. So we limit the hammer that we have to use to more of a scalpel on curtailments where it makes, where it's needed most to protect our downstream water users and our aquatic life and beneficial uses, as opposed to doing watershed-wide curtailments based on limited information. Our staff and your staff are now stepping into the implementation. We received resources in this year's budget to help permitting of recycled water projects around the state. And as those move forward with the direct portable reuse and indirect portable reuse that's been on the regs, we expect to see increase in permitting of water recycling facilities over the next few years, and you do have the resources to be able to help do that. And I will leave it there at this point and open it up for any questions.
Thank you both. It's been really exciting to really be able to synthesize across our state agencies the actions we need to be taking in unison to continue to better prepare California for the climate that we know we all have now and will continue to have here into the decades ahead. And was fortunate to have a year like this to really put into practice what just a year ago we had synthesized and thought that we were coming into another year of drought. And we all collectively have felt that jerk into flood space. And again, this document has really helped us. Looking for questions and comments from folks. Eileen.
I just wanted to mention that we brought back one of our former senior employees, Shala, to help us track and implement some of these goals that are set out in the water supply strategy. And as Jonathan says, this is going to get more and more real for you all as we're in implementation, and we are going to be tracking the progress of permits and helping if there are issues, if you're getting stuck, if there are bottlenecks. So try to let's all take advantage of that. But I really wanted to compliment Nancy, because I think that this very much more simplified, focused, if we lose 10% because of the hotter dryer, if we lose 10% of our supply, how are we going to make it up? How are we going to balance this equation? Really simply has, I think, been helpful. I'll ask Jackie in our communication strategy, because before, when people said, like, why should I care about stormwater? We had some convoluted answer about it, but now it's like, because we only have a certain number of sources to increase our supply. It's not just we're going to build a bunch of new rim dams. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, but all of these are a limited number of these factors are going to contribute to supply. And there's also the conservation side. The demand management side, and we're starting with a lot less focus on that, but we do have our conservation regulation that was developed in conjunction with DWR that is out there, and it's part of the formula, and when you add up how much did you save and how much did you add, you got to get to what it is that you need. And I think that simpler formula has really helped us articulate why are you pursuing a conservation regulation? The answer isn't just because the legislature told us we had to. It's because it's part of the, equalizing that or getting to the goal that's set out in the strategy.
If it's okay, I'd like to add to that. I completely agree that it's been really useful as a communications tool, because having something we can point to, especially with the media, and that we're making clear progress on across all our different projects. So we can say this recycling project down here will add this much acre feet per year, this one over here. And then over time, we're showing this general, we're building momentum toward this goal, and the goal is time bound with 2030, 2040. I think it's been a really useful communication tool for the public, and the water supply strategy itself is really easy to read. It's really easy to digest, and I think it's just been really helpful for us in terms of creating a sort of umbrella structure across all of our communications that points to a common goal. So yeah, thank you
for that.
Don't thank me, please, because I think the credit goes to Carla Nemeth at the Department of Water Resources had that original thought, and Jonathan. I think Carla and Jonathan were the real leaders behind the water supply strategy.
Other questions?
Okay. Sure. John Scandara from Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board. First of all, great presentations. I wanted to at least make a comment on the desalination portion. I did have a chance to read the guidance on permit streamlining for desalination plants. And the interesting part of it was it talked about brackish aquifers as well as seawater desalination. What I was very disappointed about the guidance was that most of the treatment really revolved around seawater desalination plants. And I think there really is a need for guidance on siting desalination plants in inland aquifers, particularly where you have high salinity or low quality aquifers. I think that's a huge water resource for us. Now, with respect to ocean desalination, I think we want to really watch closely what happens with the Doheny plant. It's it could go up to as much as 15 million gallons a day. It involves extraction as opposed to intake. We're going to see how that whole thing goes. With respect to large scale desalination, I have to say I'm extremely skeptical about that, the 50 to 100 million gallon per day plants. Now, interesting enough, I was not on this board when it took up the Poseidon project. Rather, I was on the Huntington Beach Planning Commission, which took up the Poseidon project, the very first agency. And I remember, well, you can never forget something like that, but the opposition to that plant developed in the streets and neighborhoods of Southeast Huntington Beach. They detested the idea of this big, huge, gigantic desalination plant right next to this big, ugly power plant that they all detested. And once they got started, well, they pulled in environmental groups, environmental justice groups, and it just became almost impossible with their opposition. And I predict that if you have a similar kind of plant anywhere else along the coast, you're going to run into the same problem. So I think, if we're going to go as ocean desalination, we probably want to do the smaller scale projects as opposed to the large scale projects.
So I'm glad you noticed that the brackish desalination was in there, and it's pretty light, and there's a good reason for that. We are working together with the Department of Water Resources to identify basins and areas where there's a high potential. I think it's been ignored as a big water source that we're trying to identify where and how we can make that a more attractive alternative. From there's much less environmental issues related to brackish desalination. It uses less energy because it's less salty for desalination. It does have some problems. The farther inland you go, is the brine disposal becomes a big issue that needs to be addressed. But that is one of the tasks that we're working jointly together on, is identifying those places and projects for brackish desalination. I don't disagree with you that it's pretty hard to get a 50 or 100 million gallon day subsurface intake for desalination. But what we found is that if you want to have a streamlined permit, you can't have an open ocean intake. There is just too many impacts that need to be studied and addressed to allow for really streamlining of that process. And so maybe the solution, maybe you're right, is a number of smaller plants brought online where they're needed, when they're needed, as opposed to a large facility in preparation for a future need.
Yeah, I really appreciate those points in that question. And I think for me, the important thing is, these goals are at a kind of statewide level. But the reality is you go down to the local level and you have a lot of discussion. You have a lot of weighing of what are impacts amongst different water supply options. But again, being able to articulate them in the same space, being able to understand what those trade-offs are, which again, the water supply strategy doesn't articulate because it's hard to at a state level, but really it provides that basis for that local level discussion where, there is a fine tuning of where does desal fit in? Are there brackish water options that are low cost? I'll say I'm proud that we funded with Prop 1 dollars a brackish water plant in Menifee with Eastern Municipal Water District. And there, I mean, coming from the Coachella Valley and knowing the region, you know, Hemet and these communities are incredibly disadvantaged. And that sort of resource, though, that is laying off of pressure from the Colorado River, replacing and creating more local resilient supplies, is all what the water supply strategy really is trying to accomplish here, and is hard ultimately because there are, to your point, so many local considerations, but that's where that conversation has to be, and that's where it can really empower this work that we're doing.
Thank
Other
you.
questions,
This
please.
is Jane Gray, Region 3. That just sort of keyed up my question, and really appreciate the presentation, circling back on the discussions we had last year, and this really well communicated, visually rich document that you all put together. I think it's great. So I did sort of want to understand how, in a larger sense, we are threading through the clean, safe, affordable drinking water discussions and equity pieces as we, you know, go around the state and communicate with folks in communities that have concerns about desal and affordability, that they're not meeting that bar already, right? We're still having a lot of hurdles in meeting safe, clean, affordable drinking water, and understanding that in shrinking supplies, that is going to increase. So just wondering how we're addressing that.
So the water supply strategy looks at not just desal. Desal is the piece that tends to get a lot of attention because it's the most expensive. Okay, but really it talks about all the pieces that we're looking at, and raises up for folks in a subtle way the cost associated with different strategies. And when you're looking at affordable water, the cheapest way to get affordable water is to conserve what you already have. And so that's part of the message in here, is that we need to conserve, because that provides the most immediate and inexpensive supply available for local resilience. It also talks about recycled water. Recycled water is expensive compared to conservation, but less expensive compared to ocean desalination. It doesn't make a judgment in there. It just gives the information about that. We're not as good about the cost associated with stormwater capture and infiltration because, as I said, we're yet to figure all that out. But things that are not in the supply strategy but are supporting it are we have incentivized capture and infiltration in our industrial stormwater permit by saying, you know, if you capture and infiltrate the 85th percentile, you're in compliance with your stormwater permit, because our modeling has shown that level of capture means that about 92%, I think that was it's somewhere 90% of the time you meet your water quality standards, which is good enough to meet the to show that it's not impaired from that. And so I think there are a lot of pieces to this that are all leading to that first slide of how do we get to 10% reduction. And so, yes, it is very important that we don't go to the most expensive option, because that affordability piece is really important, not only to us and the municipalities, but to the ratepayers at the same time. And we have a lot of work to do on our infrastructure. We need to be really smart on where we're spending that money.
If I can add, I'll just note, there is a paragraph. It's not as, you know, as expansive as a lot of the other direction, but around affordability. And because of your point, Chair Gray, that these decisions are huge drivers of affordability. So are things like pollution, and responsible parties may be out there for that, and then otherwise it falling to communities. So I highlight that paragraph. It's worth kind of reading. It really summarizes our values around it, and the need to figure something out that is a little more permanent. I know right now the state board has an arrearage program. We just approved another $600 million to pay off drinking water and wastewater debt. but and speaks to, I think, that growing need. So really appreciate that leadership, Chair, and that question. Other questions, please.
Yeah.
Patrick and then Jean-Pierre.
Well, just a quick comment. I know my former board chair would have instructed me to camp outside Jonathan's desk if brackish water wasn't included in the desalination portfolio, because it is so near and dear to ensuring resilient supplies in the Central Valley. And I would state that kind of as an observation. I think the fact that we have this 18-page document out on the street has really helped all of the dischargers that we work with understand where the administration's priorities are in a very succinct way, and really kind of tied them. If you want to pitch a funding proposal, if you want to understand where the money is going to go, how we're going to view prioritization within this space, it has to be through this document. And I think that's really helped. I think the only, and it's not so much a criticism as it is just an observation, that I know some of the Valley communities that we've spoken with have said that, we would love to explore recycled water options. And I think the drive towards overall numbers sometimes hurts that picture, because, if you have a community of 300 that would love a recycled water project, but doesn't deliver that volumetric, boost towards that ultimate goal, that's a challenge. And I think everybody in the regional boards understands that, a gallon of water delivered to a community that is desperate for clean, safe, and affordable drinking water is perhaps more valuable than another gallon of water delivered to an agricultural portfolio in some cases. And so I think that that's something that, at the end of this process or in the middle of this process, if we can continue to develop milestones that speak to equity goals for communities that need sources of new drinking water, I think that would be helpful in case we, have interim steps that might not necessarily add to the totals that we're trying to achieve by 2040, but might have a tremendous impact in those communities where the need is most acute. But again, my gratitude goes out to kind of the progress that's being made on this portfolio.
Here, I'll just chime in. I appreciate that, Patrick. I know Turlock and Ceres recycle their water. It goes to Del Puerto. It's not the norm here when we see that sort of intersection, but the possibilities are. I'll note I was fortunately up in Ukiah, where they celebrated their 1,000,000th gallon of recycled water, a smaller community. So it's a Ukiah's. It is a Ceres of the world, and Turlock said, I think we're looking to figure out how we not just have San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, the big hubs of, to your point, larger amounts, but where are we going to get the most benefit, and how do we view that? Really appreciate that. Jean-Pierre.
Thank you. So, we talked about supply side, demand side, and I've always looked at our California water resiliency as a three-legged stool, which is water augmentation, conservation, and innovation. Yes, augmentation are the supply side, conservation, the demand side. But, one of the big water users in our state is agriculture. So, comment were made about recycled water for agriculture. Well, there is a value in Title 22 in addition to, potable to a higher level, indirect potable or direct potable reuse. But I wanted to mention, one of our sister agencies, CDFA, where I think there's a need for even a closer collaboration, because, CDFA does regulate agriculture and it has many projects, such as a SWEEP program, which is in, your little 3-ring binder there. No, multiple ring binder. So in the innovation, I think we still have a lot of opportunities, because, as a state of California, we've been known to be a state where we are a leader in many technologies, and yet I think we're not leveraging enough as a whole those opportunities. Case in point, weather stations for evapotranspiration agriculture. We still have a very limited amount of deployment of weather stations, through the semi-stations program. Now there's pilot projects with UC Cooperative Extension There's also, as you know, work done where we can use satellite to identify ET, just as an example, and the lower cost of other technology for soil moisture sensors. So I bring that up because when we talk about, say a 10% reduction, it's one thing when we have the extreme drought, say, okay, everybody, turn off the spigot or at least pinch it. But I think trying to be a little smarter about it goes a long ways. And I think in past years we've been too reactive, and so we need to become more proactive. And if Carl was in the room, he always liked to bring how to leverage universities in the program. But we have a lot of very smart people, in different universities working on these topics. So I just want to bring up that other component that we can do a lot to help ourselves, being with the highest producer of agriculture, fresh produce in the country.
I agree. Innovation's tough because the state, by its very nature, tends to be beyond, behind the leading edge, as we should be, I think. But I just want to brag a bit about something that the Department of Water Resources did in this past winter that I thought was nimble and helpful. And I think it was born of the good relationships that have been built between DWR and the Water Board as well, with local groundwater sustainability agencies. It became real clear when we had high floodwaters that we were running out of places for growers to put that water to recharge their aquifers. DWR pretty quickly pulled together a temporary pump program and a rip and chip program, whereby they were helping locals get the equipment, growers that they needed to rip out orchards and vineyards so that they could create permanent basins for recharge, so that this year, this winter, and in future years, they will have places for recharge and the temporary pumps to help get the water there. And I think we learned a lot managing that, and we needed the Water Board right beside us every step of the way, for the permits and so on. Anyway, I was pleased.
And I totally agree with you, Javier, that there is a lot we can do in the in innovating in producing our crops with less water in the end. But as Nancy said, we're not probably the best people to be out in the front of that, but we shouldn't be in the way of it.
Mike should come to you here, Norma.
Norma Camacho, Region 4. When we talk about brackish water desal and the opportunities that are there, one thing that we have to think about too, with all of these projects really, is conveyance as well too. And because conveyance is really important, because you're trying to get the water where it's really needed at a certain time that it's needed, and it has to be able to go through either the existing system or set up new conveyance systems in order to allow for that to happen. And especially with brackish water desal, you may have opportunities in one area, but the community is not necessarily needing it at this point in time, but there are other communities that could possibly use it, maybe through some type of set of water transfers or agreements. And so we need to look at just conveyance as well. I know that Nancy had talked about that too, with the Friant system as well too. You saw the importance of conveyance, but also making those transfers a lot more expedited and easier would be helpful as well.
Yeah, so not directly on that point, but in your region, they're looking at the two big recycled water plants. To make that work, they're both doing trades between areas, so that and building a giant pipeline. I think you're going to need to do both. Looking at where you can substitute imported water for that to free up that water for someone else, and and look at, building pipelines from the coast for both, many of the brackish seawater projects that are envisioned are in areas where you've got seawater intrusion barriers already, and you can utilize that to get it, but that's at the coast, and you might need it somewhere else. So.
Looking around the room, if there are any other questions. And I'll say on that last point, I'll add as well, especially for recycled water, as we know, the time of day, the continuous nature of the production of recycled water means, it's not always going to match up with time of day. I was glad that we were able to use state revolving fund dollars actually to fund a reservoir for Santa Margarita Water District, Las Trampas. And there it's for recycled water, right? To really begin, to your point, Norma, conveyance and storage, at those levels are going to be really important, as we really design these systems to be thinking about, time of day production, and, we're just going to another level. So really appreciate those questions. Looking across the room to see if there's anything further. There will be plenty further over the course of the next year in this work. And just want to thank again, Nancy and John. We can give them a round of applause for their incredible leadership and work. We have an incredible amount to celebrate and be thankful for amongst all the challenges. And so just, thanks again for everyone's time. We're coming here to the end of WQCC. I'm looking to see if there are any particular announcements from Meredith. I need to make sure I give you one. I would like to actually open up our poll again, and I think they're both open now. There are two questions. One is an open-ended question, and it's around topics that folks would, I think they're both actually open-ended there, or one may be a word cloud actually, because I combined one. So one is a question about what you would like to see for further topics and follow-up over the course of the next year. And the other question as well is on top of that, what you would like to see at next year's WQCC. So that's open in the Slido if you all have an opportunity to answer that. And then additionally, the last question on there is just a word that you would all like to use to kind of characterize your mindset for the year ahead. So feel free to add to those. Just thank you all. I know that your work is incredibly difficult. We don't overcompensate you as voluntary board members for the time, the participation, the attention that it takes to do the incredible work that you're all doing. But your representation of your communities, your expertise in this space is going to be leaned on, especially over the next years as we see our work just becoming more important. As we recently celebrated the 50 year of the Clean Water Act, 50 years of Port of Cologne. We have a lot to continue to reflect on. Let's continue to make sure we focus on what those spaces might be. I'll follow up with the chairs at our monthly meeting, but it'd be good to make sure that we this year institute a few brown bags, a couple of webinars at the very least for further engagement with regional board members. I think this space that we have shouldn't just be once a year. It is so valuable to us. And so I commit to making sure that we have greater follow through so that we can have some through lines through a number of the discussions we had, whether it's the racial equity work that we have, whether it's responding to the Sackett decision, whether it's a water supply strategy and all the intersection therein, being able to continue to create the basis of incredible leadership and support that I see across the table here and across the work is what I'll commit to doing. So thank you all incredibly for a fantastic couple of days. Look forward to the year ahead. Reach out if to Meredith, if you have any suggestions for improvements in this convening for future years, and we'll definitely have an opportunity to circle back with each other. So thank you. This meeting is now adjourned of the Water Quality Coordinating Committee meeting. Looking forward to next year's. Thank you all again. Safe travels. Be well.